That's right. Good deal, folks. It looks like we got everybody now this morning. So, as I said, welcome back to day 2 of Post Licensing 302, your contracts and closings class. If you recall, yesterday we got into some basic contract law discussions. I'll tell you, here's the crazy thing. I'm teaching a pre-licensing class at night, so I had to teach them last night, and we're in the exact same section of pre-licensing that y'all were in on this, because we're talking about contracts and contract law and stuff. So my brain is like all jumbled, because I'm like, I said this in the morning and this at night, but I think I can handle it. So we talked about the different things that a contract can be under basic contract law, right? Contracts can be unilateral or bilateral. Unilateral is one promise. Bilateral is two promises. We talked about valid, void, and voidable, right? Valid is a contract that contains all the essential elements, which is presumably enforceable, but may not be if in this particular state the statute of frauds doesn't recognize that something has to be, or it does recognize that something has to be in writing and it's not, like a contract for the sale of real property in North Carolina. You could have a verbal agreement to sell real property, have all the essential elements under basic contract law, but since it's just a verbal agreement, it's not enforceable per the statute of frauds in North Carolina. So void is no contract at all, not enforceable on either party. Most common examples of void was declared mentally incompetent by courts, or for an illegal act or lacking an essential element. Voidable, one party has the right to potentially get out of the contract. Minor, somebody who was under the influence at the time of signing, would be considered voidable. Of course, we've got the terms executed versus executory. Executed meaning completed, fulfilled, finished. Executory means things are left to be done, but we are under contract. And then we got into some of the more detailed discussions on the essential elements of the contract, and we spent a lot of time on the mutual assent, mutuality of assent, reality of consent, mutual agreement, all these different names that it has. And so one of the biggest pieces of that is, of course, the offer and acceptance, because all contracts are voluntary. So it starts with an offer, and then the offeror has signed it with all the details on it. They send it over to the offeree. If the offeree likes it, they would sign it, which is indicative of acceptance. But them signing it is not enough to form a contract, and so the critical piece is communication of acceptance, and that communication is always going to the offeror or the offeror's agent. Which leads us to where we left off yesterday. So I'm going to put this in the chat just in case you need it again. So here's the link to the activity we did yesterday that we're about to go over. Let me click this button as well.
Recording in progress.
And now we can pick up where we left off. Let me share my screen with you here. So the end of class yesterday, I put you in these breakout rooms, and you were supposed to work on this activity of, do we have a contract? Trying to decide based on the scenarios if a contract had in fact been formed, if they could revoke their offer, all these different pieces. So let's take a look at number 1, okay? Todd, buyer, makes an offer to purchase on a property through his agent. His agent delivers it to the listing agent, who promptly delivers it to the seller. Seller is excited about the offer and wants to accept it. He signs the offer, places a copy in the mail to his agent, and calls his agent to communicate his acceptance. His agent congratulates him for selling the property. Do we have a contract? What y'all come up with on this one?
Yes.
We had no.
You had no?
Yeah, we had no.
Yeah, we said no because the buyer's agent has not been notified yet.
Let's talk about it. The easiest way to keep these straight in your mind is to draw a little picture here, okay? We got the OR side, we got the E side. So Todd Buyer makes an offer to purchase on the property through his agent. His agent delivers it to the listing agent, so it's over here on the east side. The listing agent delivers it to the seller, still on the east side. Seller is excited about the offer and wants to accept it. He signs the offer, places a copy in the mail to his agent, and then calls his agent to communicate his acceptance. It has never made it back to the offeror or the offeror's agent. It is over on the east side still because he told his agent. But the offeror nor the offeror's agent knows. It's got to break that plane and get back to where it started. And if it doesn't, we do not have a contract. Everybody with me? Sometimes these little visuals help you out. If you can, you got to see where it starts, where it goes. Okay. Let's take a look at number 2. Susan is a listing agent and leaves her seller's house late on Friday night with an accepted offer, just signed by the seller. Knowing that it is too late to contact the buyer's agent, she decides to simply fax the accepted offer to the real estate company of the buyer's agent in the morning. The next morning before Susan goes to her office to fax the offer, the buyer's agent calls Susan and notifies her that her buyer is revoking their offer because they have found another house. Can this buyer revoke their offer?
Yes.
Yes.
They still haven't received acceptance, so.
Yeah, so apparently this was late at night, who knows what time, they got it signed at the seller's house, and so this agent says, well, I'm going to go to my office in the morning to fax the communication of acceptance. Prior to going to the office to fax this, they get this phone call that says, we're revoking our offer. Communication hasn't happened, which means it's an offer, and an offeror can revoke their offer anytime prior to unconditional acceptance. Folks, what should Susan have done?
I sent it that night.
She should have sent it that night. Now, obviously, fax is not the best way to go anyway, but what she should have done is just scanned it in and emailed it. Midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, doesn't matter because an email has never woken up anybody. Like, don't call, but you can email it, and then it would have gone in the inbox, and it would have been considered under contract the second it hit their inbox. That's what she should have done, but she didn't, so they could revoke their offer. Everybody good on that one?
Yeah.
How about 3? Luke Byers made an offer on a tract of land in Leland. He has not received a response from the seller in a few days and decides to pursue another piece of land in the area. He writes withdrawn on a copy of the offer, initials and dates the form, and places it in the mail directly to his agent. The next day, the seller decides to accept the offer. He signs it and places a copy in the mail directly to the buyer. Do we have a contract?
No.
We went back and forth on this one. I said yes, because he sent it directly to the buyer.
I think we also went back and forth on this one. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I said no. And I think the rest of my group said yes. I can't remember.
So-
Yeah, we said no because, or I said no because he has mailed the withdrawal, so isn't that like the mailbox rule, even though it doesn't usually happen via mail now?
So here's the thing. Let me preface this with the mailbox rule only applies to communication of acceptance. Anything else that was to get mailed would not be considered delivered until it was actually received. So the mailbox rule only applies to communication of acceptance. However, there's another point that we have to make here. So let me show you, give you a little visual. Let me mute my phone so it doesn't. So as I said, the best thing to do is to have this little diagram, okay? So we start with the or. Luke has made an offer on a tract of land in Leland. So it's gone to the offeree. He has not received a response from the seller in a few days and decides to pursue another piece of property. He writes withdrawn on a copy of the offer, initials and dates the form, and places it in the mail. Here's the other problem, directly to his agent. He mailed that withdrawal letter to his agent, not the offeree. So even if the mailbox rule did apply, he didn't mail it to the appropriate person to withdraw the offer. Now, if he had mailed it to the offeree, it technically still wouldn't have kicked in because it's not a communication of acceptance until the offeree received it. Mailbox rule only applies to communication of acceptance. So in this regard, the offer is still alive and well. So the next day, the seller decides to accept the offer. He signs it and places a copy in the mail directly to the buyer. Mailbox rule does kick in. It has been communicated as soon as it's been in the mailbox, and so they are under contract.
I got some homework to do.
It's very informative, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the whole point of this exercise. It makes you think a little bit. Well, number 4, Lucy Smith is working with a first-time buyer. They have found the perfect home in Wilmington with a great offering price. Lucy presents an offer on the property to the listing agent, who returns it requesting a larger amount of earnest money deposit. Lucy delivers the offer to her buyer, who wants a few days to decide. A few days later, the buyer notifies Lucy that she has accepted the counteroffer and will drop off a copy on Monday. She fails to tell Lucy that she added a few days to the closing date since we have been negotiating for a week or so. Lucy calls the listing agent and communicates acceptance of the offer. Do we have a contract?
Yes.
This one was confusing for me because I thought because she changed the closing date, didn't that technically make it a counter offer and not accepting the offer?
It did. So here's the deal. If you look at this little diagram, just to help you out here, you can kind of see the way that the roles reverse, okay? So found a perfect home with a great offering price. They present the offer to the listing agent, who returns it requesting a large amount of earnest money deposit. So what happens is now the roles reverse. The seller is the offeror. The buyer is the offeree. That offer is dead, and so now it goes back this way. So with that counter offer, they deliver to the buyer, who wants a few days to decide. A few days later, the buyer notifies Lucy she's accepted the counter and will drop off a copy Monday. She fails to tell Lucy that she added a few days, and so they signed it, but they presumably put a strike through, changed the days, and remember, they would need to initial and date that change, and now that would change the rules again. Now they're back to the or, because any change kills the offer. And so when they take it back, it is now still just an offer. Now, guess what happens though? When this agent doesn't verify this and they turn around and they tell the seller that they have, quote, accepted their offer, that agent has committed a misrepresentation. They have made a statement that's not true. I'm going to tell you a real world story, folks. This is absolutely true. Something like this happened last year. I was in a commission meeting listening to the hearings, and there was a disciplinary action taken out on 2 agents. Here's what happened. Buyer put in an offer on a property through their agent, and they had to sell their house, and so they had requested a really long due diligence period, like 30 days or 60 days or something like that on the offer. The sellers signed the offer, but they changed that 30 days or 60 days, however long it was, to something like a week. But their listing agent didn't catch it. So they signed it, told their listing agent that they accepted the offer. The listing agent communicated acceptance to the buyer's agent. The buyer's agent didn't check it and communicated acceptance to the buyer. The buyer, when they got the copy, realized that their dates had been changed on the due diligence period from the very long period to about 6 days. And they said, that's not what we agreed to. They called the bank and canceled the earnest money check. They called the bank and canceled the due diligence check. The sellers were up in arms because the checks bounced. They both filed complaints on each other. So because the agents didn't bother to verify the information, both ended up with disciplinary actions taken against them by the Real Estate Commission for negligence in their job. Now here's the point I'm trying to make here. If you send an offer to your client to sign, Dotloop, DigiSign, DocuSign, they better only have the ability to sign unless you are having discussions about making changes. Furthermore, if they're doing it in writing, an actual paper copy, and you're not there watching them sign it, you better flip through every page and make sure that they didn't put it, because the people that are not real estate professionals don't realize that they can't do silly crap like changing dates, changing monies, changing times. Any change constitutes a counteroffer. And so in this case, this is a counteroffer, and that agent committed a misrepresentation by telling them they were under contract when they were not.
So we do not have a contract.
Nope, no contract.
I got them. We got them.
How about 5? Seller Ryan Jones receives an offer on his property located in Hampstead. He likes everything except the price, so he changes the price, signs the offer, and sends it back to the buyer through his agent. After several days, Ryan receives a call from his listing agent. He's bringing him a full price offer with no contingencies. Since Ryan has not heard back from the first buyer, he quickly signs and accepts the new offer, and his agent communicates this to the buyer. Do we have a contract?
Yes.
Yeah, with the second buyer.
Yes, with the second buyer. But what needs to happen?
They need to let them know that their counteroffer is withdrawn.
Revoke the counter offer. There you go, folks. Remember, offers are living, breathing things. So when they sent this counter offer, signs the offer, sends it back. Okay, sent that counter offer. That thing is alive and well and can be accepted. So when they turn around and accept this second one, they're under contract. But there's this thing sitting out there that could potentially get them under contract a second time if they don't turn around and kill it. Because that buyer has no idea that they just accepted another offer. They don't know that. They're not omniscient. They don't know. So that you would need to revoke that counter offer lest you risk being under contract twice, which is a very bad thing, especially as a seller. Everybody good on that one? How about 6? Listing agent receives an offer by email without any other communication from the buyer's agent. He sends it to a seller who in turn signs it and faxes it back to him. The listing agent then faxes it back to the buyer's agent without any other communication. Do we have a contract? Yeah. A lot of you are nodding your head. Absolutely we do. Folks, there is nothing saying that communication has to be a cutesy-tootsy email that says, congratulations, we've accepted your buyer's offer. We're so excited to work with you on this transaction. There's nothing stating it has to be that. If one party signs it and that signature is communicated in any way, shape, and form back to the offeror or the offeror's agent, we have a contract. Let me give you a further real-world example. Is this common? No, but could this happen? Yes. If you were the buyer's agent and you sent an offer over, but let's say that for whatever reason, the buyer's agent had the email addresses of the buyers and the sellers. And so they plug the offer into dotloop and they share this offer with the buyers and the sellers simultaneously. Buyer sign, seller gets a notification. Seller signs, buyers get a notification. Are we under contract? Yeah. Because they have been informed that both parties have signed. They are aware with no changes. That would make it a contract as well. Is that common? No. But could it happen? Absolutely. How about 7? Buyer Becca makes an offer on a house listed for sale. The seller wants to accept the offer but lives out of the area and does not have immediate access to a fax machine or computer. He tells his agent that he will sign it as soon as possible, but to go ahead and inform the buyer that he has accepted the offer. Later that day, the listing agent informs the seller they have received another better offer. Can the seller accept the new offer, or do they already have a contract?
Yes.
They can accept the new better offer, is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think so too, but I don't know how them verbally telling them they accept them, like what kind of problem that would be.
So,
I think we were saying yes, but maybe it's not the right thing to do.
this is an interesting one. And this is where I'm going to give you some insight, folks. Okay? If you ever have somebody telling you anything like this, you tell them to go to hell. And let me tell you why. There is no such thing. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as verbal acceptance. That's not a thing. In North Carolina, the statute of fraud states these have to be in writing. You cannot verbally accept an offer. Do not be an agent that thinks that is a thing, because it's not. And so I want you to understand why you don't ever do this. I want you to picture that you turn around and you do what this person says, and you tell this buyer the seller has accepted your offer. You as a real estate professional saying that means that they have signed it and you're communicating that acceptance, which means you are under contract. Now picture that you say that and then this better offer comes in later. Do you think that this seller is going to sign the worse offer when this better one came in? No. So you know what just happened? You just, once again, committed a misrepresentation because you told somebody you were under contract. The seller's refusing to sign. Now you have to tell them there is no contract. They're going to report you to the real estate commission. You're going to get in trouble. Don't ever say we're under contract unless it is signed and you're communicating that signature. Furthermore, let me give you some more insight into this. If you ever see in the MLS a house and your client really loves it, but you go to the MLS and you look at it and it says something like, verbally accepted an offer, awaiting signatures. If your client really loves it, send the freaking offer. Because legally they're obligated to deliver that offer to the seller if they're actually following license on commission rules. And if they're not under contract, send it. Because if yours is better, there's no such thing as a verbal offer. A verbal acceptance. And so let me give you one more example of what not to be. I have been a listing agent many, many times in my life. And every once in a while, I will get a buyer's agent, which while I admire their gumption, it drives me nuts. Here's what they'll do. They'll call and they'll say, just want to check on my buyer's offer. And let's say that their offer was the best offer. Don't you ever say, once again, that we've accepted it, we're going to accept it, or anything like that. But what they'll try to do is they'll try to say, well, how's my offer looking? You can only say, well, right now the sellers are looking at it as very favorable and there's a good chance they may accept it. Don't you ever say they have accepted it. Don't you ever say they will accept it. But what's going to happen is you're going to have that one dingleberry agent that after you say they consider it very favorable, they're going to say, so we have verbal acceptance. You got a verbal acceptance? Are we verbally under contract? And you just tell them, no, stupid. There's no such thing. I said they consider it favorable. I'll keep you posted. That's what you tell them. Don't ever say something like, we've accepted, we will accept. Never. Unless it's signed with no changes and you are communicating that signature, don't ever say anything like that. There's no such thing as a verbal acceptance. Period. Everybody good on that one? Now, in today's day and age, who doesn't have, the ability to email back something, but technically. About 8, Derek, a listing agent, calls Kate, the buyer's agent, to communicate the acceptance of the buyer's offer. But the conversation goes like this. Hi, Kate, it's Derek. Well, hey, Derek, I'm so glad you called. The buyer wants to withdraw their offer on your seller's house because they have found one they like better. Derek says, well, I'm sorry to hear that, Kate, because I'm calling to inform you that the seller has already accepted your buyer's offer. I hope they can decide that they will be happy here. I'll bring you a copy of the accepted offer in a little while. Is there a contract between this buyer and seller?
I think no. I think it's basically whoever talks first in that situation.
Folks, it is the wild, wild west of real estate. You remember when they take 20 paces and they say, draw, and whoever shot first won? It's just like that. So in this scenario, Kate communicated the revocation of the offer prior to Derek communicating the acceptance. A lot of people are like, but Derek made the phone call. Doesn't matter. Maybe he was calling to tell her the weather was nice today, to have a great day. Ask her what her favorite bubble gum was. Who knows? You can't definitively say that that's where they were calling. Now, let me be honest with you. Folks, if you're a buyer's agent and the listing agent's calling you, there's only one reason. Because they're communicating acceptance. They're never calling you to tell you that you didn't get it. So Kate's very lucky the conversation happened this way. If I was Kate, I would have answered the phone right when I saw Derek calling me and I knew my buyers wanted to revoke their offer. I would have answered the phone, hey, Derek, my buyers want to revoke their offer. And then I would have hung up. And then I would have texted it too, right? To make sure that there was no confusion that my buyers were revoking their offer. So as soon as I hang up and I text him that, and he calls back, he's like, what the hell did you just say? I said, oh, I'm sorry, Derek. My buyers want to revoke their offer. What were you calling to tell me? I was calling to tell you that they had accepted. Oh, well, too bad. I already revoked it. Sorry. I also sent you a text. If you're checking your text messages, I already sent you one. Sorry. That's how I would have answered the phone. Now, this, believe it or not, does not happen often. And of course, when we come down to it, this is semantics, right? He said, she said, because there's no visual, physical proof. All we have is a phone call. We don't have text messages. So if you're ever in this scenario, it's best to just let it go either way. Whether you won, whether you lost, let it go either way. Because let's say Derek did say it first, and she's in the process of saying it. It's very hard for them to prove that who said first. And do we really want to go to court when we haven't changed the status in the MLS? We haven't done anything like that. We should probably just let it go. But, you know, case by case basis, I reckon. I'll tell you the other trick too. If you're like half the real estate agents out there, your inbox is full. And so if I was Kate and I saw Derek calling and I knew my inbox was full, I was like, I'm just going to let it go to my full voicemail. He can't leave a voicemail. And while he's sitting there trying to leave one, I'm going to text him like, sorry, Derek, I hate to tell you this, but buyers revoked their offer. But if he would have said it first, technically they would have been under contract. But she communicated revocation prior to him communicating acceptance. I know, it's crazy. How about 9? Ashley is a listing agent for a very sought-after property. Within the first week, she receives 3 offers on the property. She meets with the sellers and discusses the offers. The seller makes a counter offer on one offer and wants to know the buyer's response before applying to the other 2. In the meantime, another one of the buyers makes a better offer and the seller is interested in accepting it. His listing agent, Ashley, emails the buyer who received the counteroffer and revokes the offer. She then communicates the acceptance to the buyer who increased their offer. The buyer who received the counteroffer calls to say they have accepted the counteroffer. When she mentions the email she sent, they say they never received it. Is there a contract, and if so, with who?
The second buyer, a higher offer.
Okay. The second buyer, the higher offer.
I said the same thing, but I think it depends on like if they actually emailed the right person.
Sure. Let's clarify that because you're absolutely right. Understand that when they emailed to revoke the offer, as long as it was, as Sam said, emailed to the correct email address, that is an appropriate revocation. It is timestamped. It doesn't matter whether they've seen it or not. Of course, if they sent it to the wrong email address, there was a typo, anything like that, then they never technically revoked it. And so arguably they could be under contract twice. But as long as they sent it to the right place, whether they saw it or not is irrelevant. And then the second one, you know, when they got that bigger offer, they could accept it. It's just one of those things where, you know, you just want to make sure that you don't actually accidentally get under contract twice. When you send a text message, when you leave a voicemail, when you send an email, all these things are timestamped. It doesn't matter whether they have seen it or not. Okay? All that matters is that it was communicated. Now, furthermore, it doesn't really, I keep saying this, they don't actually have to see the contract. Let me give you a couple real world scenarios as to how you can use this knowledge to your advantage and to your client's advantage. Let me give you 2. I had a house I listed a couple years back in Raleigh. It was an awesome bungalow in downtown. It was renovated inside. It was a beautiful house. And I think I listed it and went live on it on a Thursday or a Friday. And it happened to be the weekend of one of my best friends getting married. And so I was going out of town for his wedding that weekend. So on Friday when I listed the house, we had a couple showings that Friday. And the very first showing wanted to put an offer. So they sent the offer over to me. And it was a good offer. Maybe, you know, full price, you know, decent due diligence and earnest money. And so the sellers are like, wow, I mean, we would consider this. We would take this. And I said, okay, well, there's a couple other showings. And they said, okay, well, let's see what those do. And, you know, we'll decide if we want to accept this one or not, because we don't want to lose them. So the second showing happened and the agent said, well, we might make an offer. I'll keep you posted. And I told her, okay, well, we've already got one. So here's the point of the story. I was going out of town that weekend. I had already negotiated a little bit, you know, or talked to my sellers a little bit before I was hitting the road. And so here's what we decided. They said, okay, listen, we don't want this offer to disappear, and we would accept this offer. So why don't we give this other offeror, the other buyer, until 7 o'clock tonight to get us an offer? And if they don't, we will accept this one. I said, great. Here's what we're going to do. I'm about to get in the car and drive 3 hours out of town for a wedding. So how about I do this? I'm going to send you this offer. You're going to sign it. It's going to sit in my inbox. I will wait until 7 o'clock. And if we don't receive an email from this other agent or a text message from this other agent, I will then communicate that acceptance to this offeror. So understand, my sellers signed the offer with no changes, but that didn't make us under contract because the critical piece is communication. So I got in the car, I drove to somewhere out near Burlington or past Burlington to this little bed and breakfast, got checked in, and it got to be 7 o'clock. Hadn't heard anything from the other agent. I text my buyer or my sellers and I said, hey, haven't heard anything. What do you want to do? They said, okay, let's accept the offer. I said, great. All I had to do at that point, because it was already signed, is I turned around and I sent a text message to the first offerors who sent us the offer. I said, hey, congratulations. My sellers accepted your offer. Look forward to working with you. I said, I'll get you the contract when I can. Now, folks, I sent that via text message. It was already signed in my dot loop or wherever. I went out drinking with my buddy and his family that night. You know when that agent got the contract, the copy of it? The next day at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But that didn't change the fact that we were under contract because all it took was me to text him communicating that acceptance. Now, let me give you one other detail of this story just to drive this point home. Not probably 1 minute after I texted that agent and said, congratulations, we've accepted your offer, the other agent says, okay, we're going to submit an offer. Past the deadline we had given them, they text that. I went back to the agent. I said, sorry, I've already accepted another offer because you went past the deadline. Just out of curiosity, what were you going to offer? She tells me, and it was better. It was a better offer, but shoulda, woulda, coulda. We were under contract. There was that text message that stated that we were, and if I tried to back out of it, I could have been in trouble because I made a misrepresentation. I said we were under contract when we weren't. They could have gone after me. Don't do that. Now, I'll tell you the really funny side of this. We missed out on that better offer, but this house actually had a very unique driveway easement agreement because it was in downtown Raleigh and the driveway technically ran over the property line at an angle. So there was this, it was all disclosed as a material fact. I gave copies of the easement agreement and everything. When they had the survey, they didn't like the lines, and so they tried to back out, or they did back out during due diligence. So my buyers got to keep my sellers got to keep the due diligence. We put it back on the market, got it under contract for $30,000 more than we originally had it under contract for. So they made like an extra $40,000. So all's well that ends well because we got 30 grand more plus like $10,000 in due diligence or whatever it was that they got to keep. So it was a good deal. But that's where you use this stuff to your advantage. Folks, I knew I was going out of town. I wasn't about to pull my laptop out and send signatures, so I had it ready to go. So all I had to do was send a text message. When you understand this, your life is so much easier. Then let me give you one more insight here. The other time that you can use this to your advantage is, let's say that you're a listing agent and you're doing a call for best and final by 7 o'clock or whatever. And it will never fail. I promise you, there is always somebody showing the house right at 7. And they're going to give you a phone call at 7 and they say, I know you're about to review offers. We just saw it. We love it. We want to put in an offer. Will you give us time to put in an offer? Now, this is a multifaceted learning point here. In my opinion, you should always, as a buyer's agent, draft up a formal offer and send it like you are so proud of it, no matter how good or bad it is. Because if you're just getting into the business of starting to text terms, it's lazy and it tells the listing agent that you don't think your offer is worth writing up. So you should always, when you have time, type up a formal offer, fully filled out, and send it that way. However, this scenario is the exception. If we're on this time crunch and I'm about to review offers and you want to submit an offer and my seller's about to review them, here's what I'm going to tell you. I say, well, text me the terms and I'll tell you if you should even bother. Text me the terms, tell you if it's a waste of your time or not. Now, if they text me and the terms are not even close to anything we have, I'm going to say, hey, don't bother, don't waste your time. But if they text me something and it's like, oh, remember those really enticing offer? Oh, right? If they text me some terms, and that's it. that's a good looking offer. I'm probably going to give them some time to put that together, aren't I? So here's what you do. It takes a while for somebody to leave a house, get home, type up an offer, and send it over. We're supposed to review at 7 o'clock. Let's say that you have an offer that you would accept, but of course, if this other offer, as they said that they were going to send it, comes through, you would rather accept that one. So here's what you tell your seller. How about this? It's 9 o'clock. We haven't gotten it yet. No need for you to stay up. If you sign this first one, and I don't get a response from them by 11, I will communicate to this offeror that we are accepting their offer. However, if their offer comes in and it's as good as they said it is, I will not communicate acceptance to anybody. And then you will have an email in your inbox the next morning to sign all the paperwork for the new one. And I will just let everybody know that we ran into a delay, and then we'll inform them the next morning. Once again, your understanding of these could be a make or break for your client, because you're either going to get them under contract on the offer that they were completely great with taking, that they had, or you're not, and you're going to leave it open so that when this other one comes through, you can get them under contract on that one. And all the while they got to go to bed, you're the rock star agent that took care of this while they were sleeping. See how that works? Now, by that same token, homegirl who didn't fax the offer over, if you've got it, send it that night, because then you get yourself under contract, and then that ties them into due diligence, depending on what is in the best interest of your client. What you got, Dale?
Quick question. So, when you say the buyer agent should already have like a contract written up, like the actual offer to purchase, he should use that. He or she should use that.
Yep.
Okay, and what happens if the seller agrees on that because he or she already has a price with it?
What happens if they do what?
So let's say the selling agent, they write the contract up and they have a price in there, correct?
There's a list price on the MLS, but the price, it depends on who's making the offer. So yeah, so if I'm the listing agent, I'm going to have a list price of $465, but what's going to happen, Dale, you're going to put whatever you want in that contract as a buyer's agent to tell me what you're willing to offer my seller. So you're going to fill that out. I'm offering you this much. I'm offering you this much due diligence. I'm going to close on this date. All that's going to be in your offer that you send me.
Okay. Even though I haven't showed my client the property yet. Because you to understand what you were saying was you're basically saying that it was a showing at 7 o'clock. So I'm doing an offer to purchase contract before the showing and then follow back up after the showing.
Oh, no. What I was saying is that I said I was going to review the offers at 7, and you're at the house. You just finished your showing, and it's 7, and you're like, hey, we love the house. We just saw it. I know you're about to review offers. Would you give us time to send one over? Okay. And so in that regard, because they've already seen it, I'm okay with you texting me the terms. Just tell me what you think you want to offer. Not the formal contract yet. This is the one time that it's okay to just text me the terms. And then I'll say, yes, go home, type that up, send it to me. Or don't waste your time. You're not even close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent question.
Appreciate it.
Yep. So one last scenario here, folks. Nick is the buyer who needs to secure a property quickly in order to start a new job in the area. He makes a good offer on a property, and the listing agent promptly notifies Nick's agent that the seller has signed and accepted it. Nick's agent is not very trusting and does not want to tell Nick of the acceptance until he can see it for himself in writing. He calls the listing agent repeatedly for a copy of the contract. The listing agent is not returning his calls. Nick calls his agent, notifies him that if he does not have the answer today, that he may lose the job transfer. What should Nick's agent do?
You should tell him.
Yep.
You told him it's signed, so.
Yeah. Tell him he's under contract. I told you, you don't have to see it. If this agent said you're under contract and you relay that to your client and it turns out to not be true, your client can sue this other agent and report them to the commission. They said it. If it's not true, that's on them. You're relying on another broker, which we can do, to understand what under contract means. Now, a lot of people will give me the suggestion in this class, Well, call their BIC, call their broker in charge. That's not a bad suggestion, but let me give you a word of caution here. Make that a last resort. Make it a last resort. Nothing rattles the hornet's nest more than calling somebody's BIC after a very small period of time. Because here's what you have to understand, folks. Whether you've got one deal going on, no deals going on, 10 deals going on, there's always somebody who's busier than you. Don't think that people are on your level. If you call an agent and you don't get an immediate response and you're doing one transaction a year and they're doing 50, cut them some slack. They got some stuff they got to work through. Aside from that, you don't know what kind of personal crap they may be going through. You never do, right? And I can say that because, I mean, I've been in the hospital with, family members before in very dire situations, and people are like calling me asking about a showing, and it makes me want to throw my phone out the window and go gut somebody. You just never know what people are going through. So the point I'm trying to make is, if it's been a day or two, just continue to reach out, kill them with kindness. After 4 or 5 days, and it's, not something that's critical, because you've already communicated it, maybe go to their BIC. And I'll give you a real world example of this. I told you that I was managing a firm as a relatively newer broker one time. I was a pretty sharp guy, but of course I didn't know everything. And my boss at the time was technically the broker in charge, even though I managed the entire firm. And so I was managing a new construction sales team, and I did all the listings for the firm. So I oversaw over 200 transactions a year, and myself did probably close to 20 listings a year. I was pretty busy. And so somebody reached out one day to ask me a question about one of my listings, and I think it was just an email. And I didn't respond that day. And so the next day when I went into my office, my broker in charge, my boss, calls me in there. He's like, "Hey, Seth, some idiot named such and such called me complaining because you weren't responding to an email. I don't give a hell. Just deal with it, And so I called them up and I said, "Hey, listen, schmuck, I have this much going on. I have this. It's been 24 hours or less. You called him, but I manage the entire firm. So now I don't really like you because you seem like you're going to be a pain to work with." Folks, you do not want to rattle that cage if you don't have to, because we have to get along in a relationship to get through a transaction. And if all you're trying to do is put in an offer and you're obnoxious from the word go, I'm not really allowed to tell my seller to not accept your offer, but may I articulate how annoying you are and that it might be a headache to work with you. Yeah. Be very careful with, going to the BIC as like a first resort. There is a time and a place to go to the broker in charge to reach out to see if, anybody can assist you, but don't make it your first thing because it's going to piss people off, because I was livid when that happened to me. So there you go. Do we have a contract? Feeling better about the offer and acceptance piece? Kind of, sort of.
Yeah.
Sure, why not? I like it.
I made a 50, so I've got some work to do.
It's all right. This is a difficult exercise. I mean, it really is. So that's why we kind of go into it on some detail. Let me get your slides pulled up here. Hang tight, my computer's thinking.
How's the dog today, Seth?
The family's here, so the dog is fine. All right, just being in the middle of everything. It's just when they leave, the little guy goes nuts. I'm sure some of y'all remember in the other class, I had the other dog that tried to kill people, and then, that he went to a rescue to help get training and find him a home that could actually deal with him. And so we made the trade with a rescue. They took the dog that tried to kill people, and we took this. It's a poodle mix, and so he's super sweet, but he's very high energy. It's like he will explode if you are not constantly petting him. Is basically the best way to put it. So like if he's unattended or you walk by him and you don't pet him, like he will nip at you and be like, "Why aren't you petting me?" So he's just, he's a really sweet dog, but he's very needy. Put it that way.
Sounds like my lab.
Right? Some dogs just like, oh my God, pet me or I'm gonna die.
Yeah, he's very chewy, and like whenever you're petting him, he like tries to chew on your arm, like just being like, "Thank you."
Right. That's exactly right. So that's, the good news is this, the poodle he's only like 20 pounds, so he really can't do too much, but,
Yeah, mine's about 60, and he lays on my stomach at night. It's just heavy.
He thinks he's a lap dog, right? Yeah. Although, on a side note, the trash truck came this morning, and you would have thought World War II was happening outside because the dog just like lost his freaking mind. So I was like up way earlier than I needed to at like 6:30 because this dog is just like telling me that the world's blowing up outside. So bless his heart. But he's better today. It's quiet. I'll take it. Folks, we just finished this fun-filled Do We Have a Contract exercise, which leads us into the next awesome category. Now, this is where we're going to spend the most of our time, okay? This is where we get into the actual discussions of real estate sales contracts and preparation. We're going to talk about the provisions within the sales contracts, understanding the do's, the don'ts, the goods, the bads, the what happened if this happens, the everything in between. And we're going to talk about the different addenda. Now, folks, let me explain something here. You are expected to be able to fill out a contract. You are expected to be able to use the correct contract. You are expected to be able to understand what is in the contract. No, you're not an attorney, but these are all very large parts of our job. So when we deal with this, the Real Estate Commission says that you have to have the knowledge, the skill, care, and diligence. That is both part of your old car, those fiduciary duties you owe to a client, reasonable skill and care. And then it is also part of license law, because what it says is if you do anything in a manner as to endanger the public, acting incompetent or otherwise, then you are subject to disciplinary action. When they go on to give you an example of what would constitute unworthiness or incompetence, they basically say using the wrong form or not filling it out correctly. So, speaking of dogs, it is very important to not be this fellow right here. I know everybody loves the saying, fake it till you make it, right? But contracts is not the one. Do not fake the contracts, okay? You've got to know how to fill them out. You've got to know how to use them. Otherwise, you will get yourself in very, very big trouble. Because as I said, the Real Estate Commission expects brokers to possess the competence necessary to properly prepare a sales contract. That is hands down one of the most important parts of our job. So, skill, care, and diligence is required. And then the last thing here says no contract ambiguity. I've been saying that since yesterday, right? You have to make things crystal clear. In other words, stupid proof. So there's no question about what is supposed to happen. So when we're talking about this competence, continue on with it. You need to understand all of the provisions. You need to make sure that all negotiated items are included. In other words, as I said yesterday, only what's in the contract is part of the contract. If your client needs a lease back, it better be in there from the get-go. If they need a specific closing date, they better be in there for the get-go. If they need certain closing costs, it better be in there from the get-go. So incompetence, as I said, is a violation of your duties. You've got to know what's going on. So, I want you to picture going to, let's just say, a listing appointment. And at the listing appointment, you're going to have the seller sign a listing agreement. And the listing agreement is quite a number of pages at this point. And so you hand the seller the stack of pages and you ask them to form a relationship with you using this listing agreement. And they look at you and they say, oh my goodness, this is a lot of pages for a listing agreement. What all is in this listing agreement? And you look at them and you say, I don't know. It's just something you have to sign that says I can sell your house and get paid. Do you think the sellers are feeling warm and fuzzy about the fact that you don't know what you're asking them to sign? No. Well, the good news is we talk about the listing agreement in detail in Post-Licensing 301, but let's take this a step further. If you didn't know this, somewhere in the listing agreement, you were supposed to give your sellers a copy of the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T and a document on home inspections. Okay, that is part of the sample forms we're obligated to give them. So then when you turn around after that listing agreement snafu, you say, well, and here's a copy of the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T, which is currently 17 pages. And they say, 17 pages? Oh my goodness. What all is in this document? And yet again, you look at it and say, I don't know, but it's how offers come in on your property. Do you think the sellers are feeling warm and fuzzy at that point? If it was me, I'd say get out. I can't. I'm not hiring you if you don't even know what these documents mean or what's in them. Now, folks, of course, it is okay to be green, as they say, to be newer, to be less experienced. But education is a critical piece of your success. Because if you go out and you hustle and hustle and hustle and find business and find business and find business, but you're an idiot and you don't know how to take care of those people, you will lose your license, you will get sued, and you will ruin your career post-haste. You've got to know what you're doing. Finding business is only part of it. Now, a couple big pieces to talk about as we lead into the actual offer to purchase and contract, okay? Real estate brokers are prohibited from drafting contracts. No verbiage, no language, no additions, no deletions, because that would be the unauthorized practice of law. Now, understand that a party to the transaction can put whatever they want in there. So if your client wanted to draft up their own addenda, they could. You could attach it. But folks, if we're attaching a party drafted addenda, what is the likelihood that your client would draft something up with enough verbiage that it would be legally adequate in a court of law? Yeah, probably some to none, right? So if it's something that's really important for your client, maybe suggest an attorney draft it up. If it's something silly, I always give an example called the ficus watering agreement. Let's say that your buyers love a ficus that's at the property and they want it. And they want to draft up an agreement that says the seller agrees to water the ficus every single day until the time closing and the transfers the ficus over to us. Something like that, yeah, sure, let them draft it up. It's a ficus. But if it's something very important, maybe let's have an attorney draft it. And we can't draft anything. We should not be adding in contingencies. We should not be adding in special language. Can't do that. Now, we talked about the contracts a little bit after that crossword puzzle.
Just ask a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I got a little confused on this during pre-licensing, but if we are a party to the contract, explain how that changes things, if you would.
Sure. So when we're dealing with your clients, of course, an offer to purchase and contract is between the seller and the buyer. So because your buyer is a party to the contract, that's why they can draft up anything they want. And so they could draft up their own contract. Folks, if the buyer and seller wanted to draft something on a napkin, that's okay. They could do that. It doesn't have to be a standardized form. So brokers can't draft things on behalf of them, but if you were the party to the contract yourself, Steve, the broker, wants to buy Steve a house, Steve could put whatever he wants in his contract because it's not for others. It's only the unauthorized practice of law when it's for others. So the contract that we are allowed to change every day as real estate brokers, the agency contracts, because we're a party to it. We're a sub-agent of the firm, and so we could put verbiage changes in the listing agreement. We could put verbiage changes in the buyer agency agreement because we are directly a party to that contract. If you're buying your own property as a real estate broker, you can put whatever verbiage you want because it's for yourself. So it's only the unauthorized practice of law if you're not an attorney and you're writing in verbiage or contracts for others. We can't do that. There you go. Good question. So we got into it after the crossword puzzle, and we kind of talked about the standardized forms. Folks, the standard forms that we utilize are not drafted by the Real Estate Commission. They are drafted by the North Carolina Association of Realtors in conjunction with the North Carolina Bar Association, NC Attorneys. And they are exclusively for the use of realtors. They are branded with a realtor logo, and only realtor members are allowed to use them. Now, I told you the Offer to Purchase and Contract Standard Form 2T is a very common form that we utilize more often than anything, but it's not the only form we have. It's not the only form we use, but it is the first one we're going to focus on today. Now, that form, because it's just one we do use, you have to understand how this comes to play or how it comes to pass. North Carolina Commission Rule 58A.0112 talks about sales contracts. And what it states is that a broker can utilize any pre-printed sales contract drafted by an attorney so long as it contains 19 required provisions that are required by rule, and so long as it does not contain 2 prohibited provisions that are prohibited by the rule. It just so happens that the 2T was drafted in a way that is in complete compliance with 58A.0112. So the 19 separate provisions, as you might imagine, are all the different line items, the names of the buyers and sellers, the purchase price, the loan amounts, the earnest money, the what happens if we mess up. All those different things are covered in the 19 required provisions. So I told you all your standard forms are from the NC Realtors. Your listing agreement, your buyer agency agreement, your agreement to amend, your DDRA, your additional provisions addendum, your offer to purchase and contract form 2T, your new construction offer to purchase, your vacant lot and land, all of those are from NC Realtors with the Bar Association. The only 3 documents that you use day in and day out as a real estate broker that are authored by the actual North Carolina Real Estate Commission, the Working of the Real Estate Agents Disclosure, the Mineral Oil and Gas Rights Disclosure, and the Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement, the RPODs, the MOG, and the WWREA. Of course, they have a slew of Q&A brochures that are available to you, but we don't use those every single day. Now, another important note to be aware of, folks, a lot of people really consider that the offer always starts on the buyer side. Legally, it doesn't have to. Sure, that's the most common practice, but you could use the offer to purchase and contract as an offer to sell by a seller as equally as you can use it as an offer to buy by a buyer. Let me explain. If you are a listing agent and you get a showing scheduled for John Doe of ABC Realty, and then John Doe of ABC Realty schedules a second showing, and John Doe of ABC Realty schedules a third showing for the same buyers. Folks, what does that tell you about those buyers?
They're strongly interested.
Yeah, they like it.
Yeah, that's probably a good bet, right? Most people don't see a house 3 times unless they really like it or they really hate it and they just want to make fun of it multiple times. But probably that they really like it, right? And so let's say that you pick up the phone and you call John Doe from ABC Realty and you say, hey, third showing, how they feeling? He's like, man, they really love it. They're on the fence. They're first-time home buyers. They're a little nervous. I'm trying to get them to make the jump. Folks, what's stopping you from going to your seller and saying, let's make them an offer? Nothing. You could go to your seller, talk about what a price that they'd be happy to see is, have them draft up an offer to purchase, and send it as the seller offer or to the buyer's agent. Hey, John, listen, I know you said that they're on the fence. I just wanted to make them feel a little more at ease. We'd love to work with them. Here's an offer from the seller. Take a look at it. See if your buyers are interested in pulling the trigger. Nothing stopping that from happening. That is a tactic that a lot of people don't realize that could get you a sale. I'm not saying it's common, but you could do it. So it can be equally used as an offer to buy by a buyer or an offer to sell by a seller. Either is okay. So I told you that these 19 required provisions are in there, but there's also those 2 prohibited provisions. Let me tell you what they are. The prohibited provisions, we cannot talk about brokers' compensation in any way, shape, and form on the sales contract. Folks, where do we talk about our money?
Exclusive right to sell listing.
Yeah, the agency agreements, right? The agency agreements, buyer agency agreement, listing agreement, that's where we talk about our money. So we do not talk about our money on the contracts at all. Okay. The other thing that we cannot put in there is a disclaimer of liability, where we basically say, hold us harmless if we do something wrong. Nope. You're not being held harmless. Okay. You have a job and an obligation as a real estate broker. So you cannot put any kind of disclaimer of liability into the offer to purchase and contract. And so if you look right here, I'll show you this real quick. You go to ncrec.gov, publications, commission information, laws and rules book. And then, as I said, 58A.0112. Right here. Sales, offer and sales contracts. Broker acting as an agent in a real estate transaction shall not use a pre-printed offer or sales contract form unless the form describes or specifically requires the entry of the following information. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 19. So these 19 required provisions, which are all the things that are in the contract. And then 20 says any other provision or disclosure is required by statute or rule. So 20 is kind of vague. This says, well, if there's anything other than this that's legally obligated to be in there, it needs to be in there too. So here's the 2 prohibited. Broker acting as an agent in a real estate transaction shall not use a pre-printed offer or sales contract form containing 1, any provision concerning the payment of a commission or compensation, including the forfeiture of earnest money to any broker or firm. Or 2, any provision that attempts to disclaim the liability of a broker for his or her representation in connection with the transaction. So those are the 2 prohibited provisions under the rule. This is where I told you parties to the contract can alter it, they can add stuff in, they could draft their own contracts. It's not necessarily a good idea because the likelihood of it being legally adequate are slim to nada. So if it's something that's very important that your client wants to add into the mix, probably have an attorney draft up that document. It's going to be the best bet.
Seth, I got a question.
Yeah, what you got?
So it can be legally drawn and it does not have to be on Form 2T to make an offer.
Correct.
Okay.
But it does need, well, I guess let me rephrase that. Here's the interesting thing about the interpretation, right, Phil? If you look at 0112, it says a broker acting as an agent in a real estate transaction shall not use a pre-printed offer or sales contract form. But in theory, if an attorney drafted one from the word go and the parties were using it and we weren't technically like filling in the blanks or doing anything with it, then it probably technically wouldn't even need to meet all of these criteria. Now, I'm not here to interpret this rule to that extent, but yeah, I mean, you, as long as an attorney drafts it up and we don't, you could probably have it any which way and form. Yeah.
I mean, in my case, that's what these people do for a living.
Yeah.
And they drafted their own contract. It's not on Form 2T.
And that's okay.
It's very thorough.
Yeah, that's okay. Now, it's just, the only thing we have to be careful of is how we utilize contracts that are not these standardized forms, because sometimes, that can get us in trouble. Yeah.
Okay.
So, when we're talking about the 2T, folks, here's the thing. It is my hope, my desire for you that whether you're affiliated or not yet, when you do affiliate, or if you are, that you have somebody that you can go to for guidance. Whether it be your broker in charge, a mentor, a manager, a trainer, something like that. And here's why. Because remember I told you, contracts are not the fake it till you make it scenario. Because you're going to go out and you're going to advertise and you're going to try to get business. You're going to say, I can help you buy and sell. I can help you buy and sell. I can help you buy and sell. But folks, for those of you who haven't experienced it yet, there is nothing more nerve-wracking than actually finding somebody who wants to buy or sell and you've never done it before. So now you've got this schmuck who's like, yeah, okay, help me buy a house. You're like, holy crap, I didn't think that was actually going to work. I have no idea how to put in an offer. And then you're sitting there at crunch time. They got a deadline. You got to have it submitted in 4 hours and you've never written an offer before. You know what kind of anxiety that causes in people? Your heart is going to be in your throat. Your stomach is going to be in tangles. You are going to be freaking out. And you don't want to make a mistake. So I really hope that you have somebody that you can reach out to who can hold your hand and walk you through it the first couple of times. Because especially when you get into the point where you're having to fill out the PIN number, the parcel ID, the plat map, looking in the deed book, finding the deed, page and all that stuff, that nobody trains you that well, okay? They kind of drop the ball on that in most places. So here's the point I'm trying to make. Folks, if you don't have a support system where you can call somebody, you might want to find a different place. The other piece is, if you ever find yourself in a situation and you have no one to turn to, let me preface this. You can always reach out to me, but I'm a very busy man, so I can't promise that I'm going to be readily available. So don't call me with a 30-minute deadline, okay? I might be teaching a class and you're out of luck. But here's the other thing. If you're ever in crunch time and you've got nobody to help you, there is a form called the 2G. It is the guidelines to completing the 2T. So if you don't have anybody else to turn to, you can look at this form and it will walk you through line by line the expectation of how to appropriately fill out the 2T. So that is a last resort, but it does exist. So be aware of that. It's called the Guidelines for Completing the Offer to Purchase and Contract, Standard Form 2G. But hopefully you have a person that can help you with these things.
You're exactly right, because right after I got my license, I was talking to this couple and they knew my background. They knew I had connections. And they wanted me to list their property. It's like a dog chasing the car. I've caught it. Now what do I do?
What do you do with it?
Yeah.
That's exactly. It's funny, Phil, because for me that was 8 years ago, but I still feel it. Oh, yeah. I still feel it. There's nothing that it sits with you when you have that. Like, especially too. It's funny. Most people start their real estate journey as a buyer's agent. Okay, that's just generally that's where most of us start. You find a buyer first. And so then you do a couple transactions and you get used to buyers. You get used to scheduling inspections. You get used to timing. You get used to this after a few. And then you get your first listing and it's all over again. You're like, wait, I have to research what? I got to have all this information. I got to have this measured. I got to have this. So then you get your first listing. You're like, oh my God, listings are so terrible because there's so much work. But then once you get used to them, you're like, I'll never work with a buyer again. Listings are the best thing, So you kind of go through this flow of ups and downs, especially in the beginning of business, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the actual offer to purchase and contract in great detail soon. But before we get there, folks, let's talk about some very common do's and don'ts, okay, in completing the offer to purchase and contract. So let's start with this one, okay? Use of the phrase owner of record. This is a don't. In other words, what somebody will do, as opposed to actually looking at the deed and finding the name of the seller, they will just generically put in there owner of record. Do not do that for multiple reasons. It's not legally adequate, it's lazy, and there may be some surprises that you need to see on the deed. Let me give you an example of this. I was teaching a class one time, and I showed some students how to look up a deed in the Register of Deeds. So we found a random property on the MLS. And then we looked at the deed. Now, folks, in the MLS, it listed one person as the seller. And when we found the deed, that one person was on it, but they were listed as a 1% owner as a tenant in common. And there was another person who was a 99% owner as tenant in common. So if you put in something like owner of record because you didn't bother to look at the deed, you may have just opened yourself up to a giant world of headache. Because if I'm the buyer's agent and I look at that deed, what's the first thing that I'm going to do you think? If the named seller only has a 1% interest and there's another person that the listing agent didn't name, what am I going to do before I put in an offer as a buyer's agent?
Get in contact with the listing agent.
There you go. Absolutely I am. I'm going to call the listing agent. I'm going to say, Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Where is this other person at? Did they die? Is there a quitclaim deed? Do I need to put both? Did you know they were on there? Did you do your research? What's going on? Because it could really be a big headache. So don't use owner of record, folks. Look up the deed every time. And when I say deed, I mean deed. Don't look up the tax card for the owner. You know why? The tax records are sometimes updated once a year. Let me give you an example of this. When I bought a little parcel in Georgia that was abutted to my parcel last year, and I think I closed on it in March. The tax card didn't get updated until like January of the next year. Some tax municipalities only update their records once a year. So looking at the tax record is not reliable. You need to look at the deeds to see the most recent to see who the owner is. So for example, Open Door buys a house, the tax card may say Jane and John Doe, but Open Door is really the owner because it hasn't updated the tax record yet. So you always need to look at the deed, not the tax cards, no random sites, the actual most recent deed in the Register of Deeds. Let's talk about another one. Failure to clearly list fixtures that will not convey. Folks, you have already figured out just how important this is. On the listing agreement, it mirrors the exact section that we're going to look at today on the offer to purchase and contract. So, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, everything on this list, if it exists in this house, is a fixture. Are you okay with all of this staying? Is there anything we need to exclude? The opposite is true too. Personal property. Are you okay with leaving any personal property? Anything that we should include in the sale, like a refrigerator, a washer, or dryer? Now, folks, let me give you some advice right here, right now. I've had plenty of sellers who say, oh yeah, we're getting a new washer, dryer, and refrigerator, so we're okay with leaving that. And I look at them, I said, you're not leaving it, it's negotiable. If you are a listing agent, you always call the washer, dryer, refrigerator negotiable. Because if you say it's included, nobody's going to give you value for it. But if you say negotiable, you can use that as leverage to get a little more money out of them, or maybe to them not try to ask for as many concessions or things of that nature. So don't ever just put them as free, coming with the house or whatever. Even though the seller's not intending to take them, they are negotiable. Put it in the MLS as negotiable. Refrigerator, washer, dryer, negotiable. So that way they give some value to it when they ask for them. And if they don't want them, tell the seller to put them on Facebook Marketplace and get a couple $1,000s.
So, when I'm selling this land and it's got a mobile home on it, and my buyer, I know my buyer will not keep the mobile home, but I'm going to tell them that it's negotiable.
Yeah. Call it negotiable. I mean, if you want it, tell us, ask for it. Make sure the offer, shows that you want it. And if you don't want it, then, yeah.
Yeah, and my seller they may say, well, you can keep it, and my seller could get something for it, get a few more bucks.
Yeah. So, I mean, if they want it, great. If they don't, they put it on Marketplace, $100, move it or whatever, I mean, something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fixtures and personal property discussion is very important, folks, and I've already given you some reasons why. Okay, you've got to name the fixtures, you've got to name the personal property, we've got to be on the same page, because when you make mistakes in contract, it makes people hate you and it costs you money. You don't want that negativity in your life, okay? You want to keep your whole commission. You don't want to buy a refrigerator because, oops, I forgot to spell this out. Let me tell you another one that drives me nuts, okay? Failure to define critical dates. Folks, it happens, but let me give you some really good advice here, okay? Before you put an offer in as a buyer's agent, pull out a calendar. Do not try to schedule a closing on Easter Sunday at the end of this month. I promise you no attorneys are working on Sundays, let alone Easter Sunday. But sometimes new agents will just pick a day that's 30 or 45 days out, and they won't bother to look at a calendar. Real estate attorneys are the most vacation people that you will ever meet. They do not work Saturdays or Sundays. They do not work any holidays. They do not work the Friday before the holiday. They do not work the Monday after the holiday. So you better pick a closing date that you know they're actually working. Look at the calendar. The other thing is true of due diligence periods. Don't put 2 days on there. By the time you get under contract, your due diligence is done. Put something that makes sense. You need to pull out a calendar. You need to know what day your due diligence ends. Make sure that 5 o'clock is attainable on that day for all parties. Make sure you know when the closing date is. Make sure you know any initial or additional earnest money dates. You need to pull out a calendar before you send any offer. I have had that happen where somebody sends me an offer and it's for like a closing on a Saturday. And I say, hey, listen, slick, it's cute. We're not closing on Saturday. Try again.
Seth, I can speak to that one.
Go ahead. What happened?
No, that was my first transaction. It was Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. All were in the way.
Yeah, that's right. That big, that crazy one that you had last year. Yep, I remember that. Folks, that time of year, you really got to look at a calendar because it's holiday after holiday. The same right now. Easter is right around the corner. If you look at a 30-day closing, I mean, it's getting tight. I actually have a closing myself this month, and I specifically scheduled it, before Easter Sunday. So it's like the 26th because, it was that sweet little spot, before it happens. You got to look at the calendar. You got to look at holidays. You got to look at banking holidays because banks, lenders, attorneys, none of them are working those dates.
Except dates are, that's easier, in my opinion, than, say, due diligence money. So I told you the example yesterday, my daughter got that offer. The due diligence period expired at 5 o'clock that afternoon. So that person was serious. I mean, they put $50,000 down in due diligence money and said the due diligence period expires at 5 o'clock on this day, and they will close cash closing in 2 weeks. So they were serious.
They were, but at that point, what was the point of even negotiating a due diligence period?
I had to look at it 3 and 4 times and really ask the question of her agent. And
her agent, I mean, it worked out for your daughter, but sometimes when I see these offers, I'm like, this agent really isn't looking after their client. They probably didn't explain exactly what it's getting into. Hey, Phil, I'm going to tell you something really interesting right now. Okay, this is very important. I want you to listen. Let me ask you a question, Phil. Was there any earnest money on that? Nope. It was all due diligence.
Earnest money, all due diligence money.
Folks, let me make a statement, and you're going to see what I mean whenever we look at the contract. So I normally wait, but because Phil brought this up, I'm going to make a very powerful statement here, folks. If you ever give an offer or get an offer that has due diligence and no earnest money, your due diligence date means nothing.
Explain that.
Because if you were to offer somebody, let's say $1,000 in due diligence money and $10,000 in earnest money, during your due diligence period, let's say it runs until March 25th, you can back out anytime up to 5 o'clock on this date, and you will lose your $1,000, but that's it. You get your earnest money back. Everybody cool with that statement? But if you go to the 26th and you back out, you are losing both your $1,000 and your $10,000 because now you're in breach of contract. Now watch what happens. Let's keep the date the same, and instead of that structure, it was all due diligence. If you back out anytime up to and including the 25th, you lose your $11,000 in due diligence money. If you back out anytime after up until closing, you still only lost $11,000 in due diligence money. Your date means nothing if there's no earnest money on the line, because the only thing that you risk losing is earnest money if you breach contract. You're always already losing due diligence. So I'm going to say it again. if there is an offer or a contract, whichever side you're on, and there is no earnest money, the due diligence date is worthless. It means nothing. If they back out one day after being under contract, they lose the same. If they back out one day before closing, they lose the same. Very important to understand. I'll tell you a real world story here. I had sellers, or buyers actually, from California. They were looking to buy a house in North Carolina that they were going to use as a rental for a while and then eventually move here to retire. And it was in the middle of COVID, and all the houses were going like hotcakes, going way over asking. And so we got them under contract finally on a house that they liked in North Raleigh. And I want to say we had $25,000 in due diligence on the line, but no earnest money. And so we had a home inspection, found some issues with the septic, equated to about $3,000 or $4,000 worth of repairs on the septic. So we started trying to negotiate with the sellers to do some repairs on the septic. And they were working with us on it, but we hadn't come to terms. And my buyer said, well, Seth, we need to know something or we're going to terminate this deal. And I said, no, you're not. I explained this to you. You don't get any of that money back if you terminate, and we're talking $4,000 versus $25,000. So it got to be like the day of the due diligence, and we still didn't have an answer. And I had to explain to him, I said, listen, it doesn't matter. He's like, what do you mean? I said, we have no earnest money. If you were to terminate now, you would lose $25,000. If you terminate 3 days after due diligence, you're still only losing $25,000. It's okay for us to finish these negotiations for the repairs after our due diligence period ends. It means nothing because you're in it for the same either way. And of course, they actually did end up negotiating with us. And I think it was like the day after due diligence, they signed the DDRA, which is acceptable. We're going to talk about that. But there was no earnest money. So keep that in mind. When there's no earnest money, your due diligence date is irrelevant. It means nothing.
Well, in our case, it did, because due diligence ran out at 5 o'clock that day.
It didn't.
So if they didn't close, we still got the $50,000.
You got it regardless. Due diligence money is never refundable. There's very specific times that it's refundable that I'm going to teach you. There's 4, but it was your money regardless. That due diligence period meant nothing. Remember, they don't get it back. So they paid you that $50,000, whether it was a 5-hour due diligence period, a 20-day due diligence period, they still wouldn't get that money back. The only way they get it back is if you breach contract or a couple others I'm going to teach you later today. So it didn't matter for you either, because due diligence is non-refundable except in very certain circumstances. Only earnest money is protected. So if you're a buyer's agent, you want to try your best to get as low due diligence as possible for your buyer and make everything earnest money, because that's protected during that period. If you're a listing agent, of course, we prefer due diligence because it's never refundable under most circumstances. But it's, you got to find that happy medium between both parties. So folks, at this point, if you've got houses that have been on the market for a while, you better not be offering due diligence like this if it's not a multiple offer situation. You go as low as you possibly can. Hell, start with $500 and work up from there. Because if they want to get it sold, really, there's no reason to go $10,000 and put that much money on the line if it's been on the market for 60 days. The sellers just want a buyer. Now, if it's a hotcakes, you're going to have to go heavier. But if it's been on the market, don't go a lot of due diligence. You can, 1,000 and 10,000, 500 and 10,000, whatever. Go as low as possible if you're a buyer's agent on due diligence. See what you can come up with, all right? See what you can get. Let me throw in another one here, okay? Failure to timely present offers and executed contracts. Well, remember we've got the delivery of instruments rule in North Carolina. Have to deliver everything immediately and in no case later than 3 days. So you get an offer, have to deliver it immediately in no case later than 3 days. You get a contract, you have to deliver it to your firm immediately in no case later than 3 days, okay? You got to get copies to all parties. So all these instruments are immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. Now, I got a couple more to throw at you, but I'll go ahead and let you take your break for now. So it's 10:27. Come back at 10:40, and we'll keep on rocking and rolling. Whoop, whoop. So we are talking about some do's and don'ts in regard to completing the offer to purchase and contract. So the last one that we were just talking about, failure to timely present offers and executed contracts. Of course, deliver all things immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. So the next one is confusion in regard to negotiating repairs versus completion of the repair work. So let me ask you a couple questions first. How would you ask for repairs?
Through the ARPO?
It's not the RPOs, that's the property disclosure.
Your due diligence request.
Yeah, so somebody just said that too, right? So the DDRA, so let's talk about this. The DDRA is the abbreviated of the due diligence request and agreement. Now, a lot of licensees like to call it the due diligence repair agreement. It's not. It's a due diligence request and agreement, because just like the offer starts as an offer and becomes a contract, it starts as a request and becomes an agreement. So it's called the DDRA, and that is an appropriate place to ask for repairs once you're under contract. So when you're under contract in your due diligence period, you would ask for these repairs on the DDRA. When do the repairs need to be completed by?
Prior to the due diligence,
No, closing.
or no, closing. Yeah, correct. Closing.
There you go. It says that they need to be completed in a good workmanlike manner prior to closing, typically with enough time to verify those repairs. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into some of the more detailed contract discussions, but let me ask you a question. Is there any other way that you can ask for repairs?
In the additional provisions with the contract.
In the additional provisions with the contract. And so what would you be asking?
In the price.
Well, the price, but let's go back to the additional provisions and the contract really quick. What does that mean you're doing if you're asking for repairs that way?
Addendum?
Well, yeah, you're utilizing the additional provisions addendum, but what specifically are you doing? You're asking for repairs when?
Before closing.
Well, let's just circle back around, folks. If you are, let me make a statement here. We just talked about the DDRA can be utilized during your due diligence period to ask for repairs, and those repairs would need to be completed in a good workmanlike manner prior to closing. But you just told me the additional provisions addendum. Folks, you can ask for repairs on the additional provisions addendum as part of initial contract formation, meaning you're not under contract yet. You want to ask for them as part of your offer. So in other words, let's say that you take a client to a home and they love everything about it. It is their dream home. But then they look at the ARPOs and they see that the roof is 40 years old. And they say, well, I can't deal with buying a new roof. So you want to put in an offer, but the offer asks them to replace a roof. You can do that. You can send the offer with the additional provisions addendum and say, give us a new roof. If the seller agrees to it, they have now obligated themselves as part of their agreement to give you a new roof. Now, just like the DDRA, it has to be completed in a good workmanlike manner prior to closing. So that is a strategy. Yet again, folks, think about it. If you're trying to negotiate big repairs like that during the due diligence period and you've got a lot of due diligence money on the line, the seller may tell you to go fly a kite. But if they're desperate for an offer, they've been sitting on the market, that's the time to ask them for things like that because they may be willing to give them to you. So it is possible to ask for repairs as part of initial contract formation, utilizing the additional provisions addendum. You better get to that statement. No matter which one you utilize, and that's a very important tactic to be aware of. Now, folks, understand, it doesn't matter what you ask for. You can ask for anything. A new roof, you could ask for an addition, you could ask for them to change the carpet, you could ask for them to repaint something, you could ask for whatever on that additional provisions addendum. Now, I'll give you...
But now, Seth, if they agree to that, they're locked in because that's part of the contract.
That's part of the contract.
Negotiable.
Nope, at that point, when they accept it, it's part of the contract.
Already, they can say yes or no.
They can say yes or no. That's exactly right. And that's where, you know, if you've got a lot of due diligence money on the line, they may tell you no on the DDRA, which is why if it's something very important to your client, don't wait until after you're under contract for it. ask about it at that point. Now, of course, it's going to be only the obvious things that you could ask for because you haven't had a home inspection yet. But if you know the roof is outdated, the HVAC is outdated, the carpets need to be replaced, you want them to paint a wall, whatever, then you could do that.
And that's before they actually put down the due diligence, correct?
Correct, because it's part of the offer. So then you wouldn't know the due diligence unless they accept that as written.
Okay.
Yep. I'll give you a couple examples of how you might utilize this in just a little bit. So let me give you a few more here on the do's and don'ts, okay? Do make sure that you type or print legibly. Obviously, if we're using digital programs, the typing is automatically legible. But remember the story I told you yesterday about where I actually sat there at the dining room table and I hand wrote all the terms in the contract. I have terrible handwriting, so I had to make sure that it was all legible because that was my only handwritten contract that was utilized to this day. So you want to make sure that everybody can read it. Here's another good practice. When we're dealing with the lines on the contract, there are sometimes ones that you are not going to use, but do not leave them blank. If you're not using it, come in here and put NA or none. Here's another recommendation. Don't put in things like 1,000 for the due diligence because it gives the potential for impropriety of shady people to just come in and do this. What you do is you use proper decimals and commas because then there's no confusion about how much it is. Because all it takes is one person to go where you put in that there was going to be $2,000 in seller paid closing costs, them to come in and add a couple zeros after it. Now there's $20,000 in seller paid closing costs. There are not always good people in this world. So you want to minimize the potential for fraud or people changing stuff. So use the appropriate commas and decimals on numbers. If you're not using the box, put NA or none.
I hadn't heard that explanation like that since I was about 16 when I first got my checking account. And I went to a store and the store owner told me that because people can change your figures real easy.
They sure can. And not everybody is a good person. That's exactly right. Now, folks, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent on this next one. But yet again, it's a little silly, but it'll help me prove a point. Okay? This says, be precise, avoid abbreviations, acronyms, or unclear terminology. Folks, we love our acronyms and our abbreviations in the real estate industry. Right? We've got the WWREA, the ARPOs, the MOG. Okay? We've got all these different things that we love, these little cutesy-tootsy nicknames or acronyms. And let me prove a point, folks. What do we call the bonus room that is on the second story over a garage? Anybody know the nickname for that?
Frog.
Yeah. Frog. Some of you are hearing this for the first time. Some of you may have heard this before. It's called a frog. Finished room over garage. F-R-O-G. Frog. We love to call it that. Now, folks, I'm going to go off on a silly little tangent, but you have to understand how important this is. And before I tell you this story, remember, we have to put warning labels telling people not to eat Tide Pods, okay? So here's the thing. Let's say that you take some buyers into a house, and they love everything about it, but then they go upstairs to the bonus room over the garage, and it is hot pink to the extent that it burns your eyes and makes you throw up in your mouth. It is terrible. And your buyers are losing their mind. And so you, the smart agent, here's what you say. You attach an additional provisions addendum to your offer, and as part of the initial offer formation, you ask the sellers to paint the finished room over the garage, but you just put frog blue. Paint the frog blue because you can't stand that pink. The sellers accept it. You get under contract. You can already see where this is going, I'm sure. So here's what happens. You go through the process. You get there on the day of the final walkthrough. And you go to do this final walkthrough and you go upstairs and that finished room over the garage is still hot pink. And you wander down into the front yard to make sure you got a good cell phone signal so you can pick up the phone and call the listing agent and you can rip them a new one. And as you're out there just fuming, trying to figure out why they haven't painted that finished room over the garage, as you asked them to, and you start dialing, you're standing in the yard and something catches your eye. and you look over in the flower bed, and something you didn't notice the last time you were there is a little cement statue that's a decoration in the flower bed. And wouldn't you know it, it's a frog holding a violin. And you probably never noticed it before because it was gray. But you notice it today. You know why? Because it's blue. They assumed that you wanted that frog statue and you wanted them to paint it blue for you. So not only did you get this frog statue, it is in fact blue. Guess what? You asked for the frog to be blue, you got a blue frog. Now, folks, as silly as this sounds, you've got to make contracts stupid proof. Do not use abbreviations like frog. You put paint the finished room over the garage from hot pink to blue, and don't just say blue, because you'll get the ugliest shade of blue ever. You say Sherwin-Williams Arctic Blue number 7765. You've got to spell it out, Girl Scout. If you leave ambiguities, you will be disappointed. Does that make sense? Same thing too, don't ask for repairs in the MB, right? Master bathroom or anything like that. You need to spell out where you want repairs. What sink, what this, what that. Now, let me also point out something else while we're on this tangent. Folks, when I said roof a minute ago, if you want them to replace the roof, don't you dare just say replace the roof. Don't say give us a new roof. Because if you ask, they're going to put the cheapest shingles and they're going to put it over the old roof and it's going to be terrible. You say licensed roofing contractor to remove old shingles and to replace with architectural shingles with 30-year warranty. You spell it out. Do not just be vague in anything that you ask for. Tell them exactly what you want. Be clear and concise. Here's another one for you. All parties should initial and date every change, addition, or deletion. Of course, if we are using, strike-throughs and changes as our version of amendments, everybody needs to initial and date it. We do have an amendment form, which is more appropriately utilized, and it's got numbers on it. We'll talk more about that one. But just making sure that everybody shows that they were in agreement on there. If we get to a point where we've got a lot of changes and it's hard to understand what's going on in the contract, you may just want to rewrite it. Remember that novation, rewrite a new one, put that one in place, get rid of the old one. Of course, we want to make sure that we review all the provisions of the parties, and if there's anything that we're not sure about that they may need some more guidance on, they may want to consult an attorney, but hopefully we are all very well versed in the actual things within the contract. And we will be after today and next week because we're going to spend a lot of time in it, going over the contract in its entirety. So, when we're dealing with a 2T, what we're going to end up doing is I'm going to give you an activity to work through, and then I will kind of circle back around and fill in the blanks. Now, before we get into the actual 2T line by line, there's a couple other things that I want to just throw into the mix here for you. Some random questions / factoids, if you will, in regard to offers. So here's one of those random questions / factoids, okay? Here's a question. Could we prepare a contract and not disclose the identity of the buyer?
No.
Here's...
What's that?
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
No, sorry.
If it was a corporation as a buyer, you would still need to identify the people behind the buyer, right?
Well, you would just identify the corporation and then somebody with signatory authority would sign it. You don't need to necessarily identify the people who own it. That's public record. If they wanted to go to the Secretary of State, they could probably find that in the Articles of Incorporation and things of that nature. So let's talk about this for a second, folks. Believe it or not, in some states, you are not required to disclose who the buyer is. The reason is for fair housing things. So it would just say, named buyer. And that way, people aren't being discriminatory based on last names that may show different ethnicities, backgrounds, places of origin. But in North Carolina, we haven't adopted that, so we do name the buyer. However, it is possible to potentially put in an offer without naming the buyer, but you would basically be putting yourself in as a placeholder. So here's what it would look like. You would have to put your name as agent for an undisclosed principal. Wouldn't be allowed if you were acting as a dual agent. And it would definitely be a good idea to seek some legal advice from an attorney to make sure you're not maintaining any liability if this doesn't pan out. Folks, why might we do this? If you're working with a celebrity, maybe they don't have an entity, maybe they want to keep their name confidential because, it can end up causing them to pay more. Think about it. When Walt Disney bought all that land that's Disney World, he created a bunch of dummy corporations so he could buy it in names other than his own, because otherwise people would have charged him more. It's the same principle as Kim Kardashian not being disclosed to the surrogate of her child. If they knew they were the surrogate for Kim Kardashian, they would have charged more just because they knew that they had it. So you could, in theory, do this, but you may want to be careful on it. It's funny, on a side note with celebrities, I've dealt with one quote-unquote celebrity and an actual transaction before, and it's very low-key celebrity. I actually met a client while I was doing a showing one time, and he ended up being the world champion BMX pro from the previous year for BMX in Australia. So he was actually on the Australian Olympic BMX team. I helped him buy a house near the Daniel Dares, I think it's Daniel Dares complex in Holly Springs. But after I helped him buy the house in the United States, I've been keeping up with him on Facebook, and he has not come back to the United States since. So I don't know what he did with that house, but he had won a bunch of money. So it was pretty cool. I got a picture of him somewhere buying the house. But this would come into play, as I said, for celebrities. And, it's not something that would happen very often. Let me give you another thing to be aware of before we start looking at the offer to purchase and contract, okay? It is very important to name the parties as their actual legal names. So don't just put undisclosed don't just put owner of record. That's not acceptable. So name the buyers, name the sellers. And so the legal way to do it, you would not put something like, John Smith and wife. That's not enough. You would not put John and Mary Smith. That's not enough. So legal names, first name, middle initial, last name, best way to do it. And title, first name, middle initial, last name. So Mary P. Smith and husband John J. Smith, or John J. Smith and wife Mary P. Smith. Why do we like those titles? Because it lets us know what to expect with the deed, whether it be the buyers or the sellers, who has to sign, how this is going to be conveyed, how we're going to record the new ownership, because the Smiths could be brothers and sisters, right? We don't know unless you tell us. Are they spouses? Are they siblings? Are they related? Are they not? So this is the most legally adequate way to identify people as the buyers and sellers. First name, middle initial, last name, and if there's a title, first name, middle initial, last name.
Question. If you've got 21 heirs, do you need to, can you put et al. And others, or does it have to have all 21?
That's an attorney question. Ultimately, it comes down to what they want. Now, for the listing agreement, you're probably okay with something generic. For the actual conveyance of the deed, you would need all of them on there. But, for the sales contract,
Okay.
you would want all the signatures potentially, but to list them all out by name, it may not be necessary. You just got to be careful.
Yeah, I just had one with 10, and it was an older couple and that had passed away, and so are all their siblings and everybody people were just kind of dying off and mentally not capable to sign off. It was a mess.
Right.
Yep, and that's why we have attorneys, because you got to go through all the rabbit holes and figure out all this stuff out, because it gets very messy real quick, right? So here's what we're going to do next, okay? I've got an activity that I want you to do, and here's why. I can obviously explain everything within the offer to purchase and contract from the word go and make you experts on it. But I find that sometimes you have more aha moments when you kind of navigate it yourself. So I like to put you in a breakout rooms like I've been doing, new groups again, and I want you to do an activity called the offer to purchase and contract scavenger hunt, where I ask you questions and I want you to look through the contract and try to find the answer and tell me where you found it. So I just put the activity in the chat. I'm also going to put a copy of the offer to purchase in the chat, because you will need both pulled up in order to do this. I'll kind of give you some details on what I mean here. So let me show you what you're doing. Here is the activity. And so what I want you to do is, of course, find the answer to the question. Tell me what page you found it on and what provision it's on. So this first one says the house is destroyed by fire. Who holds the risk of loss? You're going to answer that. But then you would look at the, oops, I shared the wrong contract with you. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. Let me fix that. Should be.
My link's not working.
You can also just try to copy and paste it into a web browser. Sometimes people have pop-up blockers and clicking the links it gets mad at them.
No.
So this is the offer to purchase you need. I accidentally showed you the new construction one, but this one is the regular one. So here you go. So for instance, let's say that the answer to the question 1 was, right in here. You would say page 2, provision K, and then answer the question for me. That's all I need. So you're also able to use, if you think it will help you, you can use the search function. If you're not familiar with that in a PDF, you can just hit Control F. It'll open this little thing. So you could put, something in here like fire, try to find, some answers. You're welcome to navigate it that way if you think that'll help you. But otherwise, that's what you're doing, right? Answer the questions, tell me what page and what provision, and you'll have some good insights and aha moments looking through this in your groups and kind of discussing it. And of course, this isn't going to answer everything in regard to the contract, but that's where when we come back, we'll go over these answers, and then of course, I'll fill in the blanks. Now, I will tell you as we start going over this, what I like to do is around this section right here, when we start talking about prorations, I will derail us for a minute and start talking about closing disclosures and math, and then we'll jump back into the contract. It kind of breaks up the day, so we're not just like getting death by word count, death by documents. We kind of, switch to some math and then come back. So there are 18 of them. And so what I will probably do is give you between now and up to lunch break, okay? So the next 55 minutes or so to play around in this in your breakout rooms. Jaleesa, did you get it open?
I did. Thank you.
So let me give you some new groups. It is completely random, so if you end up with the same people again, I'm just making it random, so.
I do not know how to keep mine up. The other day it worked fine, but I'll figure it out.
Yeah, I was gonna say typically it just will minimize, and so what will happen actually when I stop sharing my screen, it should be easier because of the screen share. Now you can probably keep it open and have the little faces minimized. So play around with it, and I'll come through the rooms and help you out if y'all need it. But here you go. I'm gonna open the rooms. Y'all knock it out. I'll be checking on you in your rooms. If you need help, let me know. So we're working on this activity, which is a very informative and useful activity for you folks, called the Offer to Purchase and Contract Scavenger Hunt, which gives you an opportunity in a classroom environment to actually spend time looking through the different provisions, navigating the offer to purchase and contract, trying to figure out where these different things are, what pages, how they read, and everything in between. Told you I could just sit here and spit out everything that's in there for you, but this is a more interactive way of learning that I have that I feel has a tendency to cause more retention for you fine folks. So a couple of you were done. Some of you had a few left. So I'll give you another 10 or 15 minutes or so to see where you end up on this. If you don't finish, it's not the end of the world because we are going to go over them all. So I'm going to open these breakout rooms back up, let you keep going with it, and then bring you back in about 15 minutes and we'll start going over it. So here you go. There we go. Folks, welcome back. gave you a little bit more time to see what you could come up with. Of course, I will give you all the answers. We're going to review it all. We're going to discuss it. And of course, even after that, we will talk about the contract in more detail because while this is a lot of really good information, it doesn't hit everything on the contract. So we got to have discussions even beyond this. So let's go over what you came up with and start working our way through this. And remember, I told you I'm going to kind of go off on a tangent at one point and start working on some math with you fine folks throughout this. Yeah, I know, scrunch the face. I know. So, start with number 1 here. The house is destroyed by fire. Who holds the risk of loss? What are the buyer's options? And where did you find it?
The fire would be they're still under contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the seller is still responsible for the loss because the insurance should still be under the seller's name.
Correct. Seller still owns the house, so the seller holds the risk of the loss. And the buyer's options?
We came up with page 12.
Page 12.
11B.
Mm-hmm.
12. So condition of property / risk of loss. Now let's go ahead and talk about both of these pieces, okay? Condition of property at settlement. If the property is not in substantially the same or better condition at closing as on the date of this offer, reasonable wear and tear accepted, buyer may terminate this contract by written notice delivered to the seller, and the due diligence fee and earnest money deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. If the property is not in such condition and the buyer does not elect to terminate this contract, buyer shall be entitled to receive, in addition to the property, the proceeds of any insurance claim filed by the seller on account of any damage or destruction to the property. So what that means is, let's say that the house catches on fire. Okay, you're under contract to buy this house. The house catches on fire. Of course, it is no longer possible to complete this contract as initially contemplated because it's not going to be able to be rebuilt in time. It's not going to be the exact same house. There's some changes. So the buyer has 2 options. They could proceed and be entitled to the partially burned down house and the insurance money, or they could terminate and get a refund of everything. Now, here's the thing to realize, a couple pieces. Number 1, most buyers are getting a loan. Folks, a lender is not going to fund on a burned down house in an insurance policy. So most buyers are going to have to terminate and take their money back if this were to happen. Now, do understand that this section still holds true even if it's something like hail damage. Let's say a hailstorm comes through and the roof gets hail damage. Could you still close on a roof with hail damage? Yes. And there's probably going to be an insurance claim on that roof, and then that would be something that you may be able to work through where you still close on it and be entitled to the insurance money. Let me give you a huge word of caution here. This provision only applies to things that happen after you're under contract. So it said wear and tear accepted, so you cannot terminate just because, oh, there's an extra ding on the wall. And the other thing that I'll give you advice on, folks, if you are ever walking through a house as a buyer's agent and you see a rug out of place, you look at it and you're like, that's a weird place for a rug. Pick it up and look underneath it. You better. Because what happens is people will have like hardwood floors and they'll put a potted plant and that potted plant will leak and it will cause discoloration, wood rot, and all kinds of stuff. And as opposed to paying the money to have it fixed, a lot of people will just put a weird rug to cover it. So what's going to happen is you're going to get under contract. You didn't look under the rug. You're going to get there on the final walkthrough. Now the rug is going to be gone. You're going to see the damage and you're going to try to use this. And you're going to say, no, I want out. And they're going to say, well, no, that was there. You didn't see it, but it's been there. You would have to be able to prove that it wasn't there before. And if you didn't look under the rug, you can't prove that. So you need to make sure that you catch everything before you get under contract, because this doesn't save you because, oops, I missed it. This only saves you if it happens after you're under contract.
Shouldn't the inspector catch that too, though? Like,
you're already under contract at that point. So if the inspector catches it, we could potentially negotiate it during due diligence. But you can't get out in this regard because you're already under contract and you just didn't notice it. Let me give you a real world example of that, and then I'll give you a real world example of the fire thing. I listed a house a couple years ago, and it was the one that I was telling you about where we got like a stupid offer with like a very short like expiration of offer period of time. Okay. And so we got under contract to sell that house, but in the kitchen, I guess at one point, one of their cabinet doors had fallen off. And so they didn't bother to reinstall it. Instead, what they did was they just put like a little curtain rod and a curtain there. And so then like after we're under contract, I mean, it was all in the pictures. It was there from the word go. And it looked fine. It just wasn't a cabinet door anymore. So after we got under contract, I was the listing agent. The buyer's agent calls me up and they said, Seth, was that door missing from the word go? I said, yeah. I said, look at the listing pictures. It's been this little curtain rod from the word go, you know? I mean, they had no recourse. They just didn't notice it. That's their fault, not mine, because it wasn't something we hid. And I'll tell you another really real world story, okay? I had a student in my class one time. It was not this class. He was in my 301 class. And I said the same thing that I said, to y'all, to that group. I said, hey, if y'all ever need any advice, feel free to reach out to me. I can't promise I'll get back to you immediately, but you can always reach out, and if I'm available, I'll give you some good, friendly advice, but it's not legal advice. So the student reaches out, and he says, Seth, hey, listen, got a really weird situation. I said, what you got? I said, I'm a buyer's agent. I got the buyers under contract on a house. It ended up being a probate thing where we couldn't close on time because they still had to settle some estate stuff. So we negotiated a lease prior to closing. So his buyer moved in prior to closing and was living in the property leading up to this getting worked out. Well, apparently it was an older home with older wiring, and the house caught on fire while his client was living there. And so he calls me up and he says, Seth, my buyer doesn't want to buy the house anymore because he didn't realize there was this older wiring. The house caught on fire. He doesn't think it's going to be safe. He doesn't want to pay the money. What can he do? And I said, this is exactly what Provision 11 is built for within the offer to purchasing contract. So I pointed him to it. I said, read this, talk to your BIC, see if you can do that. I said, the only thing that would prevent you from being able to take advantage of this provision is if you put anything in the lease agreement that stated that they couldn't back out, that they had to buy the house or something. But if they didn't have agreement to the contrary, this would kick in. So that's exactly what they did. After I told this student that, he pursued this, he got his buyer out of it. They terminated the lease, moved out, got their due diligence and their earnest money back because of this provision. It was one of those rare times, and this happened just last year. This worked out exactly that way. The house caught on fire while he was living in it, but he hadn't bought it yet. He was able to get out, get all his money back. It's very important to know what's in these contracts so you can help protect your client, because sometimes there's things like this that can be a make or break for your client's well-being. Now, of course, the second part to this was the risk of loss part you already answered. The risk of loss or damage by fire or other casualty prior to closing shall be upon the seller. Seller is advised not to cancel existing insurance on the property until after confirming recordation of the deed. So do not cancel your homeowner's insurance policy. It'll really be canceled automatically after you close on the house, and then you would potentially get any escrow refunds or anything of that nature at that point. So there you go. There's the answer to that one. Buyer could move forward, get the insurance money, or they could terminate and get all their monies back. Those are their options. How about number 2 here? May the seller keep their wood stove insert when they move?
Fixture.
Fixture. Where is it at?
Section 2B. Yeah, we said no, it's a fixture, so unless otherwise stated.
Here you go. So we got this fixtures and exclusions, folks. Now let's look at it, okay? This is where I told you yesterday it is very important to have conversations about what is and is not personal property and fixtures, what is staying, what's not staying, what's going. You got to make these things stupid proof. So when you're looking at this section, The parties should not assume that an item will or will not be included in this sale based on an oral or written statement or understanding that is not a part of this contract. Buyer and seller should be specific when negotiating what items will be included or excluded from the sale. Goes on to say fixtures are included in the purchase price. All existing fixtures are included in the sale as part of the purchase price, free of liens, unless excluded in subparagraphs D or E. Then it goes on to say one more thing, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Buyer and seller agree that the following items, if present on the property on the date of the offer, shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price, free of liens, unless excluded in subparagraphs D or E below. And this is important. All items listed below include both traditional and smart versions and any exclusively dedicated related equipment and or remotes or devices. So if you go down, what we're specifically talking to about in this one, fireplace insert, gas logs or starters, attached fireplace screens, wood or coal stoves. So it is a wood stove insert. Can the seller take it with them? Not by default. It is a fixture that's supposed to stay. However, as Sam said, all you'd have to do is come here and say other items that do not convey. And as long as buyer and seller agree that the seller can take it, sure they can. Sure they can. But they would have to specifically put it in there. How about the next one? What are the seller's options if they don't wish to take the treehouse they built?
They got to put it in the contract because it's personal property.
They got to put it in the contract because it's personal property.
Yeah, page 5, number 3.
Page 5, number 3, personal property. Okay, Julissa says put it there. Anybody come up with anything different?
I mean, treehouse is like, it seems more like a fixture than personal property. Like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure we said like the same thing as to like, unless they're stated. I don't think most people would have a problem with them leaving the treehouse if it's there.
Okay. You don't think most people would have a problem with them leaving it, but you're kind of leaning towards maybe it's a fixture. What else?
Is it like a shed? Is it similar to a shed?
I didn't even think of that.
Is it like a shed? Is it similar to a shed? Maybe.
Well, is it playground or is it landscaping?
Is it playground or is it landscaping? Okay. Now here's the deal, folks. We've just outlined a lot of potential options. Julissa said it's personal property. Sam said it's probably a fixture. Phil's asking, would it fall similarly in grouping under storage, shed, or utility building? Caroline's asking, will landscape and outdoor trees and plants, except in movable containers, raised gardens, landscape foundation, lighting, outdoor and sound systems, permanent irrigation systems, rain barrels, landscapes, water features? Somebody else said, is it play equipment? So we've got basketball goals and play equipment permanently attached or in ground. So we've outlined a whole lot of options, and this is where I will circle back around to what I taught you yesterday. Folks, you could argue a lot of things, but does anything on here say treehouse?
No.
The answer is spell it out and make it stupid proof. If the seller doesn't want to take it with them, ask the buyers if they want it, and if they do, put it in as personal property to be conveyed. But let me play devil's advocate. If the buyers say, hell no, I don't want it, what would the buyers probably do?
Take it with them.
Ask for
I mean,
They say in the offer that they want it removed before.
And where would they say that?
The additional provisions.
Yeah.
Additional provisions addendum. Folks, imagine this thing as a death trap. It's got like 3 screws in it, and the man who put it up had never built anything aside from a toothpick bridge in his life. All right? and you want it gone because you're just waiting on it to fall out of the tree and kill Fluffy, or your kids to climb in it and break their necks. And so you say you want it gone.
Arm, that literally happened in this house.
Or your arm. There you go. So climb up the tree and break your arm.
On the stupid tree house that I didn't want up there. We've got really big trees. My husband put it 14 feet in the air, guys.
So your husband built it.
Oh yeah, and he's really good at that. It is sturdy. It is not going in.
But it's very high up.
But he put a freaking little hatch door in it. The kids were playing, forgot it was open, and my son went right through the hole.
Oh, God.
It got screwed shut that night.
Yeah.
It was one of those I told you so's.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
And so this is why you have to make these things stupid proof. So if you don't want the treehouse, you would attach an additional provisions addendum and you would say, seller to remove the janky, wobbly, questionable treehouse prior to closing. Folks, spell it out, Girl Scout. Do not say, well, I think it's play equipment. Well, I think it's like a shed. Well, I think it's like this. Don't think anything. We're not paid to think. We're paid to make sure that our clients' needs are met, right?
Yeah, so I had this one too in my one deal, and I thought that I would put it right here on number 3, but my mentor told me about the additional provisions. But they had like a trashy basketball goal, broken furniture, broken stuff everywhere, and we were like, oh, they need to take that away. And I didn't want to argue with it during the due diligence.
Yep. So you put it on the additional provisions addendum and ask them to remove it. That's exactly right. There you go. Don't let there ever be any ambiguity, folks. You know what's interesting? A student pointed this out to me, and it's kind of funny to think about. When you look at this list, there are some things that we are just assuming as a given that are not even named on here. So this is a thorough list, but it's really only designed to talk about things that we might not be sure about. If you look on this list, if I remember correctly, it doesn't say cabinets in the kitchen because we just know that that's part of it. It says mirrors attached to walls, ceilings, cabinets, or doors, and all bathroom wall mirrors. But there's nothing in here that says cabinet specifically. Well, we all kind of know that the kitchen cabinets are a fixture and they're supposed to stay. But when you've got unique things like cabinets in the garage, you need to have a discussion because that's not a normal default. Somebody could intend to take them. If you've got a workbench, I had a student in my last class saying that they got shafted because they assumed that the workbench was going to stay and the sellers took it with them. Storage units, shelves on the walls, things that are not clearly identified, things that are not clearly default, don't ever just assume you'll get them. Have a conversation. Be very specific, very thorough. You've got to spell it out. Now, if you look at this list, folks, I want to point out just a couple big items here. Alarm and security systems for security, fire, smoke, carbon monoxide, access code sensors, cameras, dedicated monitors, hard drives, video recorders, power supplies and cables, doorbells and chimes. Folks, everybody and their grandmother has a Ring doorbell or some kind of digital doorbell nowadays. It's a fixture. If your seller wants it, you need to advertise in the MLS that they're going to leave it, or that they're not going to leave it, they're going to take it with them. And it would need to be put in here as an exclusion. I am going to take my digital doorbell with me. Now, folks, if you are a buyer's agent that is a reasonably prudent and knowledgeable buyer's agent, if you are okay with them taking their Ring doorbell, because you don't like digital doorbells anyway, what might you ask of the sellers?
To take it?
Well, to take it, but then what?
Repair.
What do you mean by repair?
If you got a hole there.
Well, of course you have a hole there. There's wiring that goes to a doorbell. So what might you ask them to put there?
Another door.
Oh, another doorbell, folks. Otherwise, you're going to be looking like you're carjacking. You're going to be out there touching 2 wires together to get the thing to go off. Folks, don't let them leave exposed wires. Ask them to put another doorbell. That's one of the biggest things that people miss. Even though you may be okay with them taking grandma's antique chandelier, don't just let them leave exposed wires. Nobody wants to move into that. ask them to replace it with the chandelier from Home Depot, serial number SP56552. Don't leave it as bare wall. Don't leave it as exposed wires. Even if you're okay with them taking it, tell them what to replace it with. Very important. Now let me point out another one, folks. Stoves, ranges, built-in appliances, sure. Tennis, sure. Basketball, goals, play equipment, sure. This one, ceiling and wall attached fans, light fixtures, including existing bulbs. Folks, some petty ASS person at some point in history took every light bulb out of the house and left it with none. Otherwise, that wouldn't have needed to be put in the contract. Somebody removed every light bulb in the entire house. There's none in the bathrooms, none of the chandeliers, none on the front porch. They took all of them. And so they had to put in here that light bulbs are a fixture. Now let me tell you why that's even more significant nowadays. While that is petty and silly to most of us, understand in today's day and age, there are light bulbs that cost hundreds of dollars. They will sing you to sleep, control the temperature, tell you how to play the stock market, okay? They have some very high-end light bulbs nowadays. And so if your clients have Hue light bulbs that are $300 a pop throughout their entire house and they want to take them, they need to do one of two things. Remove them prior to photos and listing and replace them with normal light bulbs, or at the very least, clearly identify them in the MLS as that they will not convey. Make sure they make it in the contract that they will not convey. And then if you're a buyer's agent, you need to make sure that even if you agree that those high-end light bulbs are not conveying, that they put light bulbs throughout the house so you don't walk into a no light bulb home. Because as much as that just seems like a silly thing, it is expensive to put all the light bulbs in a house in one fell swoop and a pain in the butt because of all the different sizes and locations. Of course, there's plenty of other things that are, in here. Exercise equipment, I told you this was added last year for things like CrossFit equipment that are bolted to the walls, punching bags and things like that that could be bolted to the walls. Fireplace inserts, floor coverings, jeez. The attached ones, thank God. The fact that we have to tell you you can't pull up your hardwood flooring before you move out. Garage door openers, generators that are permanently wired, not freestanding ones. Invisible fences, the landscaping, mailboxes, the mirrors, the storage sheds, which are fixtures by default. Swimming pools. Now, folks, this is where I messed up. It used to just say that, built-in hot tubs. And so the interpretation was freestanding ones were personal property. But this is what it said, and I didn't realize it. Swimming pools, spas, hot tubs. Now they changed it where all hot tubs, all swimming pools are fixtures excluding inflatable. If you've got an inflatable hot tub like those Coleman ones on the back deck, that's not a fixture. But any hot tub that's a standard hot tub or pool or spa is a fixture by default. Solar or electric water heating systems, sump pumps, surface mounting brackets for TVs, not the TVs themselves. Your recessed speakers. Folks, if you got some recessed Bose speakers and you want to take them with you, once again, take them out before you list it or put them in as an exclusion because they're supposed to stay. Thermostats, smart ones or otherwise. Water supply equipment, of course, water softeners, reverse osmosis systems, whatever. And then here's one more that I just want to point out. This one drives me nuts, okay? Windows/door blinds and shades, curtain and drapery rods and brackets, door and window screens, and combination door, awning, and storm windows. So the curtain rods are a fixture. The curtains themselves can be taken off because they are just slid on those rods. That's fine. But folks, do not let any seller try to remove their blinds. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of in my life. You know why? Do you know how many different size windows there are in the world? About 10,000. The odds of your windows, the blinds from your current house fitting the windows in your next house, slim to none. Leave the freaking blinds. Don't you ever try to take those things down. People are like, they're expensive. No, they're not. It costs $1,000 to do an entire house. Leave the crap there. Let it go. They're so easy to install too. It just blows my mind that some people are like, I like my blinds. No.
Well, you may have people that want to take their shutters. Shutters are very expensive.
Shutters are very expensive, but yet again, they are also custom fit.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, one thing I didn't think about, this is very helpful. So in my house, I have light bulbs that I program, right, from my phone. So, you know, at night, I'll look on my camera to see if my lights have come on in my den, in my bedroom, and so forth, and outside. They're not cheap.
They're not cheap. They're not cheap. I've got a couple smart light bulbs throughout my house. The one that's putting this blue color behind me, that's a smart light bulb, but that's in a lamp. But then I have one downstairs in my living room that comes on every night at 8 o'clock and goes off at 3 o'clock in the morning. So, yeah.
So take it away.
Yeah, this is real world stuff, right? These are some things that we sometimes don't think about because we don't want to make these mistakes. Because really, you only make these mistakes once because you learn, you're like, oh, crap, I messed up on that one. And then it just burns in your brain. Folks, you best believe I will never accidentally lose a hot tub again. It has burned in my brain to the extent, but that's why I love being an instructor. I did 8 years of brokerage, you know, and I can tell you about everything I've experienced in 8 years. That's a lot of transactions I've done. And I've experienced it. Every single one's been a learning experience. Doesn't matter how long you've been in the business. There's something new.
I'm sitting here thinking that I wish I would have taken this class literally at the least 2 days before it started. Because I'm right in the middle. I just did my first listing. And now I'm like, I need to go back and look at that contract because I didn't even think about their Ring doorbell.
Uh-huh. And so if they've got a Ring doorbell
in the garage, you know, I didn't think about that stuff. It's not in the contract.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Ring doorbell is in the contract. If they use the 2T and you're under contract, you're leaving that Ring doorbell.
Yeah. Well, we're not under contract. We're literally just, we haven't listed it officially yet.
Oh, good. Well, then you're still got time. You just need to go back and have the conversations with the seller. So think about it. This list is mirrored in the listing agreement, and that's your time to have a conversation with the seller. But what's important is then you need to relay what you talk about with the seller in the agent remarks in the MLS. And then you need to make sure that when you get an offer, it's all outlined on this contract that Ring doorbell does not convey. What are you going to replace it with? Chandelier does not convey. You know, workbench and garage does not convey. So you just need to make sure that you're on the same page with the seller. You advertise it and you make sure that the contract outlines that as well.
Yeah, my heart started racing as you were going through it.
It's good information, isn't it? Told you this is a great class. There's a lot of good information in this class. I like it. So we will, of course, go through the whole contract in its entirety, but you kind of got a good idea of the, the fixtures section at this point. What about 4? Identify the steps for closing a purchase transaction. And what do each of the steps mean? Where'd you find this at?
3, page 3.
Page 3, provision M, talking about closing. Closing, remember, is basically recordation of the deed, but there's steps leading up to it. So what are the steps? So we say closing, the completion of the legal process, which results in the transfer of title to the property from seller to buyer, which includes the following steps. 1, settlement as defined above, which is the meeting where people go to sign their documents. 2, the completion of a satisfactory title update to the property following the settlement. 3, the closing attorney's receipt of authorizations to disperse all necessary funds. And 4, recordation in the appropriate county registry of deeds and deeds of trust, if any, which shall take place as soon as reasonably possible for the closing attorney after settlement. So all these steps lead up to the recordation of the new deed and the deed of trust to secure the mortgage that the buyer probably got. And that is when we consider it closed. That's all we were looking for there. Those steps right there. Here's where we're going to go off on a tangent, okay? What items are prorated at closing? Taxes,
Rent.
rents, HOA dues. Where'd you find that at?
11 and 12, 10. So page 11 and 12.
There you go.
10.
So right here, we've got prorations and adjustments. So let's start here on 11, as Phil said. Unless otherwise agreed, the following items shall be prorated, with the seller responsible for the prorated amounts of any taxes and dues through the date of settlement, and the seller entitled to the amount of prorated rents through the date of settlement, and either adjusted between the parties or paid at settlement. So the default is the seller, ready for this, owns the day of closing, OWNS. Good, bad, or otherwise, seller owns the day of closing as the default. What that means is if we're talking about taxes or HOA dues, they have to pay that day's worth. If we're talking about rents, if you're selling an investment property, they get to keep that day of rents as the landlord. Okay, so good, bad, or otherwise, the seller gets the day of closing. So what are we prorating? Taxes on real property, so your annual real property ad valorem tax. Taxes on personal property. Folks, when would taxes on personal property come into a real estate transaction?
Is it like a mobile home?
That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, mobile home, also called a manufactured home, also called a trailer. Remember, has a VIN number and a title. It is just like your car. So you pay personal property taxes on it so long as it is still personal property. And so if a personal property manufactured home is being conveyed, kind of like what Phil's talking about, buying land and there's a manufactured home sitting there that hasn't been converted, well, we would probably prorate those personal property taxes if that's being conveyed with the real estate. Now, of course, if it has been converted to real property, there will be no personal property taxes on it. It will all be paid as real property taxes, so you wouldn't have to worry about that. The other time that could come into play, if you're buying an investment property that maybe has a boat slip and a boat being included in the sale, you could end up having to pay prorated taxes on that boat, something like that. As weird as it is, you could negotiate a deal where somebody includes the car in the purchase. That may come into play. Go ahead, Phil.
You talk about boat slips, so I have a certificated boat slip, so they're not taxing us on that. But if it was a deeded boat slip, then they would tax you on that. I'm been trying to figure out why they're not taxing us on it, but.
Yeah, and it really just depends on the municipality and how they work on it and how they look at all that stuff. But deeded one arguably would be, taxed depending on the municipality and especially, the maritime taxation in that given area.
Yeah.
So taxes on real property, taxes on personal property, rents, and dues, okay? Now, when we're dealing with real property, that's paid every year. We're dealing with rents, that's typically every month. And we're dealing with dues, it could be just about whatever. It could be monthly, it could be quarterly, it could be annually, it could be biannually, it could be bi-monthly, right? It really just depends. But, of course, we would have to look at that and try to figure that out accordingly. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard here because here's where I told you I'm going on this tangent, okay? We're going to talk about the math and closing disclosures. I'm going to give you your basic introduction to it to kind of break up some of these contracts discussions. So I kind of gave you some insight into the 365-day year yesterday, which is the real calendar year. Pretend it's not a leap year, even though it is, because you were never testing on leap years. And we're going to just talk about the different ways that these calculations happen, okay? So let's start with taxes. If we were to say $3,300 a year, and we were closing April 8th. Well, believe it or not, this is enough information to figure out how the taxes are going to be handled at closing. Because remember, in North Carolina, the tax bill is not considered due and payable until when?
September 1.
September 1. And so that means if we're closing in April, it has not been paid yet. So all you have to do is figure out the amount per day. And then you have to realize who's going to be paying the tax bill and how do we make this fair. So in this case, since the taxes can't be paid yet, haven't been paid yet, who's going to be paying the tax bill in its entirety at some point?
The buyer.
The buyer.
The buyer.
So the way that we make that fair is figuring out what portion did the seller consume, right? They lived there if we use that food analogy, going out to eat, they live there from January 1st up to and including April 8th. So the way that you do this is you take your annual tax bill and you divide it by what?
365.
365, because we're doing a real calendar year. So $3,300 a year tax bill divided by 365 gives us what we call our per diem, how much somebody's responsible for a day. I'm just going to use standard dollars and change. So $904 a day. And so now we need to figure out how many days the seller is responsible for. So there are 31 days in January, 28 days in February because we're not doing a leap year, 31 in March, and then 8 days.
98.
98?
I got 98.
Okay, well, let me double check you there. So 31 in January, 28 in February, 31 in March, and 8, including the day of closing, in April. 98 days. Now, folks, if you are not super comfortable because, contrary to what our teachers told us back in grade school, well, you're never going to have a calculator in your pocket. You're never going to have joke's on you. Yeah, we do. We got a calculator, we got a calendar, and we got the entire world's worth of cat videos that we can watch every single day. So if you're not super comfortable with how many days are in each calendar month, there's 2 different ways that people use to remember it. I will tell you, the easier way for kids is typically the jingle. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except for February that has 28. But another way that a student, told me they like, and I suppose it works, if you just put your hands together like this, every place there's a knuckle is 31. Every place there's a dent is 30, except for the 28 that you know. So January, February, 28, right? March, April, May, June, July, August. So you got July and August are the 31s back to back. July, August, September, October, November, December. Every place there's a knuckle is 31. Every place there's a divot is 30, except for February, which is always 28. So that's where I got the 31, 28. So 98 days the seller's responsible for. Times are $9.04 a day, which makes the seller's portion $885.92. Now, folks, we're not going to pay that to the tax assessor. We're just going to do what with it?
Really?
We're gonna debit that to the
Debit and
seller.
credit.
Debit seller, credit buyer.
There you go. Debit the seller. So we're going to take this money from the seller at closing. So if I said, what would this look like on a closing disclosure? It would be a seller debit of $885. Let me try that again. This mouse.
886.03.
885. No.
What?
It's the same amount. We're taking this much from the seller and we're giving that much to the buyer. We are robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are not worried about that total tax bill because the buyer will pay that sometime after September. So all we need to do is make life fair, and we did. We took the seller's portion from the seller and gave that cash to the buyer at closing. So when the buyer pays the full tax bill later in the year of $3,300, it's fair because they got money from the seller at closing.
Where'd you get 885.92?
98 days times your 904 a day.
That's 886.02 in mine.
Did you round differently than I did?
I don't know.
98 times 904.
365.
See, I rounded to the 2 decimals. If you're leaving the whole number in there, you're going to get something different. If you're leaving like the 7 or 8 decimals, you're going to get something different than me. I just rounded to 2 decimals before I did the math.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sid, quick question.
Yep.
So how did you get the far as that the numbers for the days for the month? Because I got like in January it's 31 days,
That's what I put.
and then I got February I got 29 days.
No. I said, so this year is a leap year, but ignore that. We are never testing you on a leap year. So just treat it as 28 because all of your test questions are not based on leap years.
Okay.
So yeah, so in a real calendar year, if your attorneys are doing prorations this year, they would count the 29 days in February. But for the sake of your test, just do 28 because none of your test questions are based on a leap year. So I'll tell you what, Dale, I made this joke yesterday. As a real estate instructor who teaches prorations all the time, I have been dreading this year for 3 years now because I knew that it was going to cause some students some indigestion on the fact that we actually had a leap year this year. So I've just been like, oh my God, I'm just not looking forward to this. But yeah, just leave the leap year out of it because your test questions will never be a leap year.
Okay, and then for the March, it's 31 days. Correct?
31, yep.
And then April is 8 days.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. There you go. So it's always January 1 up to and including the day of closing for the seller. So everybody, go ahead, Julissa.
Why do we have to know this?
Mm.
Like, I get why, but like, isn't this like the attorney takes care of this?
I love that you asked that because there's always one in every class that asks that. You ready for this? Do you remember when I said you hand your client a 17-page contract and they look at you and they say, what's all in this contract? And you say, I don't know. It's a paper that people use to buy your house. And they weren't feeling really good. Well, imagine when they send a closing disclosure over and it's a crap ton of numbers that say a bunch of really weird things. Your clients have no idea what they're looking at. So they're going to come to you. They're going to take the paper and they're going to say, Julissa, what does this mean? And you're going to say, I don't know. It's just a bunch of numbers that say you sold your house.
Ask your attorney.
No. We have an obligation to be able to review it for accuracy as the broker. Do you remember in the crossword puzzle yesterday? Responsible for the accuracy of the settlement statement? Broker. We're not the ones calculating it, you're right. But you have to know what's in there. Let me tell you why. You are doing anywhere from a couple to double-digit transactions a year, depending on how busy you are. Attorneys are handling thousands of closings a year. Do you think that there are paralegals filling these in that are making mistakes? Yes, I guarantee there are. I have seen them. I have had paralegals come through my class who admit without hesitation that they make mistakes. There are times where they have the tax prorations on there for the initial closing date. It gets moved 2 months. They forget to change it. So somebody has to pay more of the taxes than they should have because it changed 2 months. The other thing I'll tell you too, every single program that the attorneys use defaults to making the buyer and the seller pay a courier fee for the loan payoff and a courier fee for, sending paperwork. Well, folks, I can't tell you how often I have had sellers who own their houses outright and the attorney still tried to charge them a $50 courier fee for the payoff check to be sent. You have to call the attorney and say, you're trying to charge my seller $50 to send a check to nowhere. They own their house outright. And they'll say, oops, I'm sorry, the program defaults to putting that in there. I'll take it off. But if you don't catch it, your client's paying $50 for nothing. There are mistakes on these things. Say again?
Very good point.
Uh-huh.
Very well said.
Yeah. It's not because we have to do it. It's because you are the real estate professional. And if you can't look at them and say, this is what this means, they're probably like, you do this for a living. You don't know what this means? Now, I get it. Folks, I was in your shoes once. And there was a couple concepts that took me a while to really grasp. Not so much the math part, but for the life of me, one of the things that bothered me, I'm like, what the hell is title insurance, right? When I was new, I'm like, why? I don't understand this. You got a house, you own it, you got homeowners insurance. What the hell is title insurance? It took me months to figure out how important that was. So some of these things kind of elude us, right? But it's very important to be able to give your client some reassurance that you know exactly what it is, that you can check and explain it to them so they can understand if there's any mistakes, you can have them corrected because attorneys will make mistakes. You know what most brokers do? And you better not be one that does this, right? Like closing disclosure comes in, they're like, where's my commission? Commission 10,600. Yeah, okay, my commission's good, I'm good. And then that's all they do to check it, right? They check their commission and yep, CD's good. CD's good. Everything's good in the closing disclosure. No issues. That's one of many things you should be checking. So this is why you need to know this. Aside from that, it helps you in your personal life. Folks, when I start talking about these math and calculations, you should be able to understand next time you buy a house exactly what you're paying. Because a lot of, I heard Phil talking about it earlier. We all have this understanding if you buy a house without being an agent, oh yeah, I got to pay due diligence. Sure, I understand it. But Phil said you really don't understand it until you become a broker. And that's such a true statement. We all, if you bought a house before you became a broker, we all went through the motions. Okay. And we signed it and we went on. But when you really start to grasp it, you become way more dangerous as an investor, as a purchaser, as a negotiator. So it's just all just building you into a well-rounded broker, both for your own personal doings and your clients. Because you also have to understand, are you going to get a tax bill this year or not? I mean, if we're dealing with $3,300 a year, I need to know, am I going to have to shell that out of the pocket? Is my escrow account going to have enough? Are they taking enough money for my escrow accounts? A lot of things come from this. So that's why.
Teresa, aren't you glad you asked?
She's so glad she asked.
I'm glad you asked.
It's funny because I have like a recording somewhere on like one of my YouTube pages or Facebook, and a student asked the exact same question, and she was like, well, Seth, not to sound like a smart ass, and I said, well, it's you, so of course you're going to sound like that. And I was picking on her because I'd had her for like 3 classes as well, and so she laughed. But then she asked the exact same question, and I gave her a very similar answer. And she's like, oh, okay. All right. So it's important, right? It's important. So let's give you another example here. Okay, let me change everything and see how you're feeling. I'm going to change it to October 27th, $3,900 a year in taxes. Now, before you can even start tackling to figure out what this would look like on a closing disclosure, you have to have a question answered for you. What question do I need to answer for you?
Have the taxes been paid?
Have the taxes been paid or not? So I'm going to say that they've been paid. So I want you to think about this, folks. This is where that dining out analogy comes into play. You got to think about who swiped their card and who's going to be giving cash. So if it's already been paid, who paid that tax bill this year?
Seller.
The seller. So how do we make this fair at closing? Credit the seller, debit the buyer. We have to take money from the buyer and reimburse them for the buyer's portion. I was trying to combine the word portion in there. Reimburse them for the buyer's portion. So here's where you're going to do the opposite, folks. The seller was responsible for January 1 all the way up to and including October 27th. So that means that the buyer's responsible for what?
The last part of the year.
Yeah, October 28th through December 31st. So calculate the amount of days the buyer's responsible for.
$65 days, I think.
So you got a 65?
I got 64.
So let me show you this while y'all are working it out, okay? We've got October, November, December. Now we know it's going to be the full month of December, 31. Full month of November, 30. And when we're looking at October, the seller is responsible for the 27. So there are 31 days in October minus the 27 that the seller is responsible for, which should be 4 days in October. So that should be 4 plus 30 plus 31 for a total of 65 days for the buyer.
Question. I didn't get the 4.
Why not?
Because the seller is responsible through the day of closing.
Correct.
And the day of closing is 27th. So we're giving the seller. No, I still don't get it.
We're calculating how many days the buyer is responsible for. So the buyer is the homeowner starting on the 28th, 29th, 30, 31.
Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry.
No worries. So they are responsible for the last 4 days of October, all of November, and all of December. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So we've got 65 days. I'm going to put that right here that the buyer is responsible for. Now, what I didn't do yet, we didn't calculate our per diem. So $3,900 a year divided by 365 days would give us a per diem. And I'm just going to do the 2 decimals. So if you don't change it in your calculator, you will get a different number than me. But your per diem of 10.68. So 10.68 or $10.68 a day times the buyer's 65 days. And so how would this show up on a closing disclosure? Articulate it for me.
$694.52. That would be credit to the seller and debt to the buyer.
Debit to the buyer, but yeah, debit to the buyer. So, and depending on how you rounded, right? So 694.20, the way I rounded, if you left it in the calculator, it was a couple pennies different. So 694.20 buyer debit, take money from the buyer. 694.20 seller credit, because the seller paid the full $3,900. They paid the full bill, even for stuff they didn't eat. Reimburse them to make life fair. Does that make sense? Now, let me throw one more thing into the mix. I'm going to make it super easy for you to practice this, okay? Here's the one thing I'm going to change. I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to change this paid to unpaid. I'm going to leave everything else the same. Now, tell me what this looks like on a closing disclosure.
So it hasn't been paid for the whole year?
Correct.
So you would have to debit both the buyer and the seller.
Mm-hmm. What numbers?
Oh, so the 694 would be for the buyer still.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of the year to the seller.
Beautiful. That's it. That's exactly what I wanted you to realize, just how simple that was. We've already determined in this scenario that the buyer's portion is $694.20. Well, folks, you got to pay the full tax bill. That means everything else is the seller's. So $3,900 total tax bill minus the amount that's the buyer's, $694.20, means it's a seller debit of $3,205. Oops, let me make that prettier. $3,205.80. Buyer debit of $694.20 to equal the total tax bill. So what happens is the attorney takes money from both. This is where I told you they bring a check. Terry had cash, I had cash. We put the cash in the book and we walked out, right? We're good. We covered our bill with cash at the same time. And so this attorney collects our money, and then at closing, after everything's recorded, they will cut a check to the tax assessor to pay the bill for that year. Our portions are done. That means the next year, it will be the entire buyer's year, and their escrow account will pay for it. All's well that ends well. We have squared away. So those are the options. It's either unpaid, so we take money from the seller and give it to the buyer. It's already been paid, so we take money from the buyer and give it to the seller. Or it's unpaid and it's considered due and payable, at which point we can't leave it unpaid, so we're just going to do a double debit and pay it at closing. That's it. So let me throw one more into the mix to make sure you're good, and then I'm going to teach you one more concept with these prorations, and then after that I'm going to talk a little bit about the closing disclosures and introduce those. So if I was to say, September 17th, they've already been paid $5,762 a year for taxes. Work this out. Put it in the chat for me when you get it. Tell me exactly how this would look on a closing disclosure. Now, you need to be very specific in the words, okay? You have to be able to use buyer, debit, seller, credit, debit. You got to make sure you get it right, because the way that your test is done, you will have multiple options, both credits and debits of the opposite parties and the correct parties being an option. So you got to make sure you understand who it's a debit to and who it's a credit to. A couple different ways you can start this, but let's just go ahead and get our per diem, okay? Our tax bill is $5,762 a year, divided by our 365 days in a year to give us a per diem of $15 and I'll round to 79 cents a day. And so the tax bill has already been paid in its entirety by the seller. So they swipe their card, so we're trying to make it fair. So we got to figure out what the buyer's portion is and take that from the buyer and reimburse the seller. So I always like to go the path of least resistance, which is calculating the buyer's days. So all of December, all of November, October. Okay, so in September is the only one that you're not sure of, because October has 31, 30, 31. And so the seller is responsible for up to and including the day of closing, so the 17 days. So the easiest way to figure out the buyer's portion, 30 days in September minus the date of closing gives the buyer 13 days. So 13 plus 31 plus 30 plus 31 should be 105 days. Is that what everybody got? 105 days times your per diem of $1,579 gives the buyer a portion of $1,657.95. Now, once again, it comes down to how you rounded. So if you're off a few pennies or dollars, it will never come down to rounding on the test. We'll tell you how to do it on the test. But so this answer, though, is we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are taking money from the buyer, giving money to the seller. So it is a buyer debit of $1,657.95 and a seller credit of $1,657.95. Because the seller paid the full bill, we need to take the buyer's portion from the buyer, reimburse the seller.
I messed up with the day for November, so it threw me off a couple of dollars.
For November?
Yeah, I had put 31 days for November and then 14 days for September, so I'm a day off on my counting. Otherwise, I did the math right. It's just the days. I don't understand that.
Look at the knuckles.
I don't know why I did it the way I did.
Knuckle, no knuckle, knuckle, no knuckle, knuckle, no knuckle, knuckle. January 31, February not 31, March 31, April not 31, April, May, June, July, August 31, 31, September 30, October 31, November 30, December 31. If you start at the edge of your hand, every place there's a knuckle, the month has 31. Every place there's a divot, it does not have 31. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. There you go. Or, pull out your phone. This isn't a test, and look at a calendar, Jaleesa. I mean, on a test, you can't pull that out. But right now, there's no reason you can't be like, hey, Alexa, how many days in November?
At least I was honest on how I got it wrong.
I know. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to help you. You could have looked, Don't you disrespect Turkey Day and give it an extra day. Or Turkey Month, should I say. So let's talk about the other proration concept, which is, pretty important because a lot of students have a tendency to get this confused a little bit because it works differently. Let's talk about rents for a second, okay? If we're dealing with an investment property that has a tenant in place, and let's say that they're paying $2,300 a month in rent, and we are closing on March 7th. Folks, I want you to think about the way that rent works, okay? If we're closing on March 7th, when March 7th comes around, where is that $2,300 in rent money at?
It's already been paid for the month of March.
Correct. So rents are paid in advance. When you make March 1st rent payment, you are paying to live there in the month of March. So as long as, hopefully, this tenant has paid on time, that means that the seller has already received $2,300 for the month of March. Now here's the thing. The seller is technically and legally the landlord the March 1st up to and including March 7th. But who will be the landlord starting on March 8th? Yeah, the buyer.
Buyer.
And so we know that the seller already received $2,300. So for rents, we're trying to figure out, okay, how much are they not entitled to keep because they're not the landlord past the 7th. So we need to calculate that amount that the buyers do, take it from the seller, give it to the buyer. Does that make sense? So in this instance, there's a couple different ways you could do this. You could figure out the amount the seller is entitled to keep, subtract that out, and then give the buyer the rest. Or you could do what you've been doing, calculate the days the buyer is entitled to, multiplied by the per diem. Now, folks, the per diem works differently. Every single month, the per diem changes. Why? Because there's different days in each month. So there's $2,300 a month. In the month of March, there's 31 days. So divided by 31 gives you $74.19 a day. And then you would calculate the amount of days that the buyer is responsible for, that the buyer is entitled to. 31 days minus the 7 days that the seller is entitled to keep, 24 days. 24 times your per diem of $74.19. So the buyer should get $1,780.56 of that. So on the closing disclosure, this would be a seller debit of $1,780.56 and a buyer credit of $1,780.56. We're just going to take the money from the seller's proceeds, reimburse the buyer for the amount they should have gotten as the landlord for the rest of March. Does that make sense? So y'all go take a break. Come back at 2:10. I'll give you one of these as practice, and then we'll move into another discussion. Whoop, whoop. So we are talking about prorations. We did a couple of the taxes, and I just kind of walked you through on the rent. So let me give you an example to just work through the rent on your own. How about $1,700 a month? Closing on February 21st. Work through that for me. Tell me what you got. What would that look like at closing?
Are we still leaving leap year out?
Yeah, just do 28. Good question. So let's work this out real quick. Okay, remember, we're talking about prorating rents. And so what we're dealing with is an investment property being sold. Okay, you own a property or a seller owns a property. There's a tenant in place. They're paying monthly rent. They've got that coming in as the current landlord. But the landlord is going to change as soon as the ownership changes. And so we said, good, bad, or otherwise, the seller owns the day of closing. So we are dealing with $1,700 a month. It is closing on the 21st. That means the seller has already received that $1,700. It's in their operating account, but they're not entitled to keep the whole amount because technically the landlord will be the buyer starting on the 22nd. So take your $1,700 a month divided by the days in the month, which is 28, which would give us a per diem of $60.71 a day. And you could figure out the amount of days the seller is entitled to keep, or you could figure out the amount of days the buyer should get. Either way, you know, just make sure you keep track of what you're doing. So there are 28 days in February. The seller is entitled to the 21 days leading up to and including the day of closing, which means the buyer is entitled to 7 days. 7 days times your per diem of $60.71 is $424.97. And so that would be a seller debit of $424.97 and a buyer credit of $424.97. Taking money from the seller, giving it to the buyer because they will be the landlord starting on February 22nd. That makes sense? Sometimes it's just getting used to like the way that the transaction flows a little bit differently, right? Because it is a monthly thing and the seller's already received that money. We're not expecting the seller to bring that money to closing. They're about to make proceeds. So we would just take it from their proceeds and reimburse the buyer. And once again, all is fair. So let's talk about one more concept leading into, the closing disclosure. Actual form. Let me just explain, folks, that a closing disclosure, settlement statement, whatever you want to call it, the nuance is that both the closing disclosure and the HUD-1 are both types of settlement statements. Settlement statement is just a document that identifies all the credits and debits for the parties. So let's just look at a basic example of this. Let's look at the seller. Let's look at the buyer. And then under the buyer, we're going to look at their credits and their debits. Same thing for the seller. Their credits, their debits. So let's just look at a standard transaction. Let's say that we've got a purchase price of $400,000. Well, as we start giving you this information, there's a couple questions we need to ask ourselves. Does this affect the buyer, the seller, or both? So let's start with this purchase price. Buyer, seller, or both?
Oops. The purchase price is both.
Both. There you go. Both. So let's start with the buyer. What is this purchase price to a buyer? Is it a credit or a debit?
Debit.
It's a debit. They have promised to pay that amount of money. So the purchase price for the buyer is a debit. What about to the seller?
Credit.
Credit, because somebody has promised to give them that amount of money. Okay? Well, what about if I said that there was $5,000 in due diligence? Does that affect the buyer, the seller, or both? Both. Let's start with the buyer. What is due diligence to the buyer at closing?
Debit.
No, he's already paid it.
The credit.
Credit. So it is paid by the buyer at the effective date, right, at the contract formation, but as long as they go to closing, they get it credited back to them. So it would be a $5,000 credit to the buyer. So what is it to the seller?
Debit.
Debit. We are taking it back from the seller, giving it back to the buyer. So it's going to be a $5,000 debit for due diligence money to the seller. Okay. What if we had earnest money of $5,000 as well? Buyer, seller, or both?
Both.
Where is earnest money?
To the seller or buyer. And
Shouldn't the earnest money be in a trust?
It would be in a trust account, but we're about to close, so it's got to leave that trust account and go somewhere.
Is it a credit to the buyer?
There you go.
Person then.
Yeah.
Just
It is a single entry buyer credit, as a couple of you said, because the attorney, the firm, whoever's holding it says, here, it's your money, have it back. It's never been touched by the seller. It would only be entitled to the seller if the buyer was to breach the contract. So earnest money is a single entry buyer credit. Everybody good with that statement? Okay. Well, what if I said that this buyer was getting a loan amount at an 80% loan to value ratio? What does that mean?
keep the 20% down.
They're putting 20% down. What else does it mean?
So the buyer would have to pay the 20% at closing.
What else does it mean?
A debit from the buyer.
So we're actually never going to name the down payment. The down payment just ends up netting in their cash to close by default. But what do we need to account for?
Mortgage.
The mortgage.
Fees.
Well, that too. So let's just start with the mortgage. Folks, you are borrowing 80% of the purchase price from the bank. So you need to calculate that. Purchase price is $400,000. I'm just going to move my calculator a little bit here so I can see everything. Purchase price of $400,000 times your 80% loan to value ratio means you're getting a loan amount of $320,000. So I'm going to change this loan amount to $320,000. So does this loan amount of $320,000, does that affect the buyer, the seller, or both?
Both.
Seller. It's credit to seller.
Just the buyer.
Just the buyer. The buyer has promised to pay this to the seller. The seller doesn't care where this money comes from as long as they get $400,000. So this is an arrangement between the buyer and the bank that the bank is giving them $320,000. Yes, they will have to pay the bank back later, but they're getting that loan now. So this is a credit to the buyer for the loan amount. The loan only affects the buyer. All the loan stuff only affects the buyer. Everybody get with that statement. Okay? So there are going to be bank costs in this as well. I'm not going to bring those into the mix yet, just because I want you to understand, the concept in a more simplistic form first. But any discount points or interim interest or any of those things would be cost borne by the buyer in the way of getting a loan. What if I said that there was a 6% commission? Well, first, let's calculate 6%. Is that 6% of what?
The sale price.
Sales price. So $400,000 times your 6% commission, which is total commissions of
$24K.
$24,000. Okay. So is that buyer, seller, or both?
Seller.
Seller. Debit or credit?
Debit.
Debit.
$24,000 commissions to the firms. Okay. What if I said the seller has a loan payoff of $212,000? Buyer, seller, or both?
Seller.
Seller.
Seller, debit or credit?
Debit.
Debit.
Debit, because they have to pay their loan balance off, right? So $212,000 loan payoff. Now, I'm going to add just a couple more into the mix that are just the matter-of-fact things, and then we'll go into the more advanced things in a moment after I explain why we're doing this. How about deed prep? Who pays deed prep? If I told you that there was deed prep of, and that looks wonky. All of it looks wonky, but deed prep of $300. Who's getting that?
Debit.
I think that's a buyer debit.
So it is preparing
Seller.
the deed to transfer to the buyer. So the deed preparation is actually a seller debit. So this one can just get plugged in. $300 deed prep. Now, if I said attorney fees of $1,000, who gets that?
Buyer.
Buyer.
It's questioning myself.
Yeah, I know. Because the attorney fees are the title search and dealing with the lender and all those different things. So attorney fees are a buyer debit. Deed prep is a seller debit. And we'll leave it at this. So let me show you how this works, folks. This is a very straightforward way to help you understand all that a settlement statement is. It doesn't look this simplistic, but let me explain. Let's start with the buyer. If these were all the facts available to us, and there's nothing else, of course there's more items than this, take a look at their credits. They've got $5,000 plus $5,000 plus $320,000, which gives them total credits of $330,000. Oops. And then the debits is just $401,000. And so what this means is that all in all, based on these events that we've created here, they have to pay $401,000. Well, they've already paid, whether it be from borrowing money or out of pocket, $330,000. So if you were to take the difference of all of their debits, $401,000, and subtract out all of their credits, $330,000, what you are left with is what we call cash to close for the borrower. This is how much they have to bring on the day of closing to be able to pay everything that they were supposed to pay. That is all a settlement statement is. So when Jaleesa was trying to give me the down payment, we don't need to talk about that because it's automatically included in this cash to close. So this includes money that's left to be brought to the table. So a settlement statement looks way more intimidating than this. That's all it's doing. Looking at the total credits, the total debits, finding the difference between the two. For the buyer, the difference between the two is how much you need to bring to closing. For the seller, if we were to look at theirs, we've got only one credit, which is not atypical. So we got a $5,000 debit. We got a $24,000 debit. We got a $212,000 debit. We got a $300 debit. So the seller's total debits are $241,300. Their total credits are $400. Find the difference between the two. $400,000 minus $241,300. The net to seller at closing is $158,700. Cash to seller. That is all a closing disclosure is. It looks way more complex than that, but it is just itemized lines of all the credits and debits for every party. Does that make sense? So when you look at an actual closing disclosure, there's a little bit more information than that. So I'm going to leave this up for a second. I'm going to pull up a closing disclosure and I'm going to show you. It's kind of hard to see. Why did it give me the wrong one? Give me one more second here. I apologize. This is the one I wanted right here. So if you're looking, and I know it's hard to kind of see what's going on here. Here is what a fact sheet kind of looks like on a, in regard to a closing disclosure question. I'm zooming out a little bit. We got the closing date, we got the sales price, we got earnest money, we got a lot of information here. And all that's really happening is an attorney would pull this information from a contract and they would start transposing it onto this closing disclosure. Now, the closing disclosure is way more than 2 pages, but this is what we call the CDC, the Closing Disclosure Core, the main 2 pages that itemize all the debits and all the credits. So on page 1, you will only ever really see debits. Really and truthfully, page 1 is your closing cost. So if you go to page 2, it's things that are not necessarily just closing costs that are a little more complex. So let's just start with page 1. Origination fees, you got the borrower, you got the seller. If it's paid outside of closing, it would go in the second category. So this is discount points. It's labeled $25.20. Loan origination fee, $25.20. Appraisal fee and credit report were paid outside of closing. Attorney's closing fee, $550, so on and so forth. So you pulled all this information from here. Now there's certain ones that are a little bit more complex that I'm going to get into in a second. But watch what happens. All of these are closing costs and they're debits. So what you do is you take all these debits from this section, add them up to get right here, total loan cost. Take all of the ones from this section, add them up to get right here, total other cost. And then you add those two groupings together. It even says this on here. Add D and I together to get J, which is total closing cost. So there's your total closing cost for the seller, right here. Total closing cost for the buyer, right here. Now watch what happens on page 2. It tells you, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Where to plug in J from that previous page. For the borrower, for the seller. So I'm going to zoom back out and show you this. When you look at this page 2, let me just show you how this breaks down. This says, it's kind of hard to see. Let me scroll back up a little bit because that thing's in the way. Due from borrower at closing. So would that be credits or debits? Debits. So this is buyer debits due to seller at closing. Would that be debits or credits? Credits. Paid on behalf of the borrower, credits or debits?
Debit.
Debits.
Paid on behalf, somebody's paying it for them.
No, credit.
Oh, okay.
And then due from seller, credits or debits?
Debit.
So you see how this works. There are 4 quadrants and they correlate with each other. Buyer debits right beside seller credits, buyer credits right beside seller debits. Why is this important? Because in those tax scenarios that we were looking at earlier, where we were taking money from one and giving money to the other, it would have to go in the corresponding box. Adjustments for items unpaid by seller. So if we were taking money, seller debits from the seller, and giving it to the buyer, it goes here. If we were taking money from the buyer, giving it to the seller, it would go here. Due diligence money, we said, was a seller debit and a buyer credit. Now this one doesn't look like it has any due diligence money on this particular one, but if we did, it would go here. Due diligence fee. Earnest money, single entry, buyer credit. So there's no corresponding place over here. So page 2 is not necessarily closing cost, but general information. And there is a home for everything. Sales price of the property, you told me was a buyer debit, goes right there under buyer debits. Sales price of the property, you told me was a seller credit, goes right there under seller credits. Earnest money deposit, buyer credit. Loan amount, buyer credit. Now, I'll explain this one more in a minute, but this is basically a second mortgage they got from the lender. So they're borrowing money from the lender, that's a credit. Tax prorations, credit, debit. And so all that happens when you go in and you plug all this information is the exact same thing. You total up the credits, total up the debits, or I guess these are the debits. Here's your total buyer debits, $291,711. Here's your total credits. You plug them in down here. Total credits minus total debits, or vice versa, should I say. And here's the cash to close from borrower. Seller credits, seller debits. Find the difference between the two. The cash to seller. It is exactly what we just did. It just looks more complicated. The beautiful thing about this is everything has a home. These are all labeled. So you're not writing these in. It tells you that discount points go here. It tells you the origination fees go here. Now, some things are a little more complex and you have to find a home for it. Let me give you an example. In this one that we're looking at right now, the taxes are divided between the parties. Or more specifically, we took money from one and gave money to the other. If we were dealing with a double debit scenario, let me show you what happens. You would come here under other and you would just write in tax prorations and you would give this buyer their portion as a debit here, the seller their portion as a debit here. Because at that point, if it's a double debit, then it's a traditional closing cost. All closing costs go on page 1. Unique things like borrowing money, taking money from one, giving it to the other, all of those go on page 2. So as you look right here, I'm just going to talk about some of the calculations that are a little more difficult, and then we'll kind of get into an example of this, depending on which way I want to go with time. April 11th, we need that because we're going to use that for prorations. Sales price, told you, that's a page 2 item. Sales price 280, sales price 280. Earnest money deposit, single entry buyer credit, right there, deposit, $4,000. Financing, $252,000. Okay, well, there's the loan amount. Loan amount is a buyer credit. Loan amount, $252,000. Conventional loan at 4.25% interest, 1 discount point, and 1 point for loan origination. Let me zoom out a little bit more here so you can see this kind of. So this is where it gets kind of confusing because this is a multi-step line item. We already punched in the loan amount. Well, let's talk about the interest, folks. This is where people struggle the most. Folks, why does the bank lend you money?
To make money.
To make money.
You make money.
And they make money off of the interest. So you have to remember that when you borrow money and you close on a house, mortgages are paid in arrears. So what that means is if you're closing April 11th, when is, by default, most likely, when is your first mortgage payment going to be due?
June 1.
June 1.
There you go. So you close in April, nothing in May. Your first payment is going to be June 1. That's not right. My brain's hurting. June 1. When you make your June payment, you are actually paying for interest in the month of May. That's what we mean by paying in arrears. When you make your July payment, you are actually paying for interest in the month of June, so on and so forth. Well, what that means is you didn't make a payment in May, but you purchased the house in April. So there's got to be a way for the bank to get their interest for the month of April because that's the only thing they didn't get. That is interim interest. And so here's why it's called that. It is interest you pay in the interim of your amortization schedule kicking in. In other words, you have to prepay the interest for April because if you did it any other time, it would mess up your amortization schedule. So the way that we calculate this is we have to figure out what your annual interest is based on your balance, divide it by the amount of days in the year, and calculate how many days you owe interest for. This is where people struggle though, folks, because when we're dealing with prorating taxes, rents, and HOA dues, we give the seller the day of closing. But this is something that doesn't affect the seller. So you have to give the buyer the day of closing. Here's what happens. The bank says, we've lent you money on April 11th. Start paying interest today on April 11th. And so let me show you how this works out. It is only ever interest for that month that you close in. So in this instance, you're paying interest from and including April 11th through the end of the month. Here's the easiest way to calculate that. You've got 30 days in April, right? January, February, March, April, 30. So you would take your 30 days in April minus the date of closing, but you have to also add in 1 for the date of closing. That is the only time you add +1. Never taxes, rents, and HOA dues. And the reason is you started paying interest on the 11th. If you don't believe me, start counting. 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. 20 days that you owe the bank on interest because you have to pay them interest for the date of closing as well. So let me show you how you calculate this. Now that you figured out there's 20 days for interim interest, remember they can only charge you interest on the loan amount. So your loan amount is right here, $252,000. Your interest rate is 4.25%. So multiply by 4.25% to get annual interest of $10,710. but you're only paying days worth of interest. So divide this by 365. And this is your per diem for interest. How much the banks want you to pay in interest a day? $29.34. So $29.34 times your 20 days is you interim interest of $406.80. Now on the closing disclosure, it is called prepaid interest. So look at the categories here. Prepaids, prepaid interest. I did something weird. Oh, I did 2034, not 29. 29.34 times 20 days. I messed that up. 586.84. They rounded differently than me, but that is your interim interest right there. That is a buyer debit. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah, yeah.
So the other parts that come into the loan thing here, one discount point. Well, one discount point is 1% of the loan amount. It's always loan amount. So 252,000 times 1%, 2520. That was a loan cost right here. Points, 2520. Origination fee, they said is 1% as well. So we've got the same number. So just plug it in there as a buyer debit. We already collected the interim interest. I just showed you how to calculate that. Second mortgage, don't freak out too much about this. It's just as I said, they borrowed money from the seller. And so it was a credit down here, just kind of like the loan amount. Borrowed money from the seller, so that's a seller or buyer credit, seller debit. They gave money and then you'll have to pay it back by way of some type of promissory note. That's not common in any way, shape, and form. It's just an extra testable, or not testable, but an extra thing to learn. Seller's loan payoff, $173,425. Well, due from seller, payoff of first mortgage, $173,425. Appraisal fee, credit report, paid outside of closing. So they come over here in this section because it's not going to end up changing the calculations. Real property taxes. Taxes will be prorated based upon last year's bill, which was $28.80. Well, folks, we just did this, so you would take your $28.80 divided by your 365 days in the year to figure out your per diem for taxes now. $7.89 a day for taxes. Seller is responsible for all of January, all of February, all of March, and then I think this is closing April 11th is what we said. Let me scroll up and make sure. Yep. So 31 plus 28 plus 31 plus 11. 101 days times your $7.89 a day. So this would be a seller debit of $796.89, a buyer credit. Remember what I told you is down here. Seller debits, $796.89, taking that money from the seller. Buyer credits, $796.89, giving it to the buyer. Clear out some of my drawings as we continue here. Homeowners insurance annual premium. When you close on a house, they make you pay a year's worth of homeowners insurance up front. So you are prepaying for a year of homeowners insurance. Go back to your prepaid section. Homeowners insurance premium, 1 year, $642, buyer debit. Private mortgage insurance. If you get a conventional loan for less than 20% down, you're going to have to pay mortgage insurance. And so you are prepaying for a year of mortgage insurance at 1%. Once again, that is loan amount. So it's actually the same as the other things, right? The 225.20, because it's $252,000 loan amount times 1%. So right here, prepaid mortgage insurance premium, $25.20. Loan escrows. Now, folks, let me explain these. Most people, when they buy a house, end up escrowing money for their taxes and insurance. You pay a PITI payment, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Only the P and I go towards amortizing your loan or paying it back. T&I go into an account where the banks hold on to your money to pay your tax and insurance bill and mortgage insurance if you have it. And so what they do is they say, well, we need some money to open this account for you, and so you have a cushion in case anything changes. So that's what this is. They want you to give them this amount of money up front to open and put in your account. So they want 5 months of real property taxes. Well, it's based on the previous year in this one. So once again, here's your year of property taxes, $2,880 divided by 12 to give you how much per month. They want 5 months. So multiply that per month by 5, $1,200. There is an escrow section. Property taxes, 5 months, $1,200 buyer debit. And then they want 2 months of homeowners insurance. Homeowners insurance was $642 a year divided by 12. Gives you $53.50 a month times 2, $107. Homeowners insurance escrows. And then the last thing they want is private mortgage insurance. Now, instead of the 1%, it's cheaper the next year. So based on a renewal amount of $882 a year, they want 2 months. So $882 a year divided by 12 gives you $73.50 a month times 2. Mortgage insurance escrows $147. Buyer debit. As we go on, a lot of the other stuff is plug and play. Attorney fees, I told you go to who? Buyer. The attorney fees are the buyer.
Buyer.
So when we go under items or services that the borrower can shop for, attorney fee, buyer debit, $550. Survey. Folks, let me warn you of something. When we work through these exercises, if you've done a transaction, it's going to bother you because you're going to be like, oh, it's paid outside of closing. If we don't tell you it's paid outside of closing, then it's just going to be paid at closing. So the survey doesn't tell you, so it's going to be paid at closing. So survey, $250 buyer debit. Floodplain certification, $20 buyer debit. Pest inspection, this is also referred to as a WDIR, wood destroying insect report. Pest inspection, $75 buyer debit. Deed prep. Who did I say got deed prep?
Seller.
Seller. Now, if you look, there is a place for recording fees, but there's not really a place. Is deed prep in here? Oh, wait, there it is. I just missed it. Deed preparation. Notice it's not on the buyer side because of the line items. You got to go over to the seller side. Seller debit, deed prep, $80. Title insurance premium. Folks, there is always, if you're getting a loan, there's the borrower's policy, there's the lender's policy. If you're getting a loan, you have to pay for both of them. So you would combine them together and charge them to the buyer. So once again, services borrower did shop for, title insurance, lender and or owner's policy, $504 buyer debit. Recording fees, it depends on what we're recording. In this instance, the new deed and the deed of trust are the buyers. Now this one is unique because there is also this purchase money mortgage. That's because that money that we borrowed, that's not going to be a common thing. In this instance, they did give that to the buyer as well because that was their loan. But normally the deed and deed of trust is the buyers. You'd combine those together. And then the mortgage cancellation, meaning the old loan cancellation, would go to the seller. Now, for whatever reason on this one, they put it down here. Mortgage cancellation, I would have just put it under buyer, recording fees for the seller. Understand that the numbers will net out either way, as long as you put it on the seller side. Revenue stamps at standard rate. What are revenue stamps?
Taxes.
Specifically, what type of tax? Say it again.
Sales tax.
Excise tax.
Yeah, excise tax.
How do we calculate excise tax?
$1 for every 500.
Of
Purchase price.
purchase price. Yep. Remember, some things we're using loan amount, some things we're using purchase price. We got to go back up to this purchase price. $280,000 divided by 500 gives us excise tax of $560. Go right here. Too far. Uses
What's
everything.
the excess tax on here?
It is right here. Excise tax. Taxes and other government fees. And then seller right there. 560.
560.
Yep.
Okay.
Last couple thing, or the last thing here is this 6% commission. Now, folks, this one is a tricky one, so I don't want you to think about it this way yet, because I want you to just understand the basic concept. Typically, the commissions will just be put in right here as a a seller debit. The problem with this one, and let me just explain it, but I don't really want you to focus on it yet. If, let's say, the listing firm was holding the earnest money, and the earnest money was $10,000, and they were about to make a commission check of $12,000, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to move that $10,000 out of their account into the attorney's account just to get $12,000 back. So what they will typically do is they will net it out, and they will basically say, okay, well, the sellers will actually not give you that $10,000 that you're already holding. They'll only give you $2,000. And what they'll do is they'll give the other 10 that you're holding that's supposed to go back to the buyer. So they're going to net it out. So what they do is they reduce the total commission, because if you look, $280,000 times the 6% should be $16,800. But they did it less $4,000, and they made the seller pay that $4,000 instead to the buyer to reimburse them for the earnest money they're not getting back from the firm. It is a very common thing whenever they hold it, but this is not something you need to focus on for the sake of just learning this. So normally it would just get plugged into that commission line. Now, after you've gone through the entire thing, I'm telling you, you just go down and you total it all up. Totals, get your closing cost. Totals, get your closing cost. Plug in buyer closing cost here. Plug in seller closing cost here, where it says J. Add up everything within here to get this. Add up everything, let me zoom out a little bit. Everything within here to get this. Everything within here to get this. Everything in here to get this. And what you are left with is the total numbers for your M, K, L, and N, and then you plug them in down here. Plug in K, plug in L, find the difference. Plug in M, plug in N, find the difference. Congratulations, you just did an entire closing disclosure.
Wow.
It's a lot, it looks a lot more intimidating than it actually is. And folks, I expect you to kind of be looking at me like I just spoke a foreign language, because I've been doing this for a while, and so it's second nature to me. So it's okay if you're like, nah, I still really don't get it. That's okay. It's a progression thing. You understand the basic concept of this at this point?
Yep.
That's all it is.
Hey, excise tax, 500. Let's see, $1 for every $500 value.
$1 for every $500 of purchase price.
Yeah.
So purchase price divided by 500. And remember, they will never accept change. So if you ever get any change, you have to round up to the next dollar.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I never calculated it like that until we're pre-licensing. And I had an aha moment, because it comes out to the exact way I was doing it every time. I was using $2 for every 1,000.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So same thing. But yeah, this actually technically $1 per 500. The cool thing about that, Phil, is when you were looking at a deed, the deeds don't ever really tell you how much you paid. But if you look at the excise tax on the deed and multiply it by 500, you can tell what somebody paid for that property.
That's right. I do that all the time.
Yeah. You can see exactly what they paid for it. Even though it doesn't say it on there, you know that if they had $600 in excise tax, 600 times 500, that's how much they paid for it. That's it.
Exactly right.
That's right. And that's how you know when something was actually a gift, because it'll say $0 in excise tax.
Yeah.
Even though it'll say for valuable consideration, the receipt of which is acknowledged, it'll still say 0, so you know it was actually a gift.
Yeah.
What you got, Dale?
quick question. So with the seller estimate net sheet, how close is that to being able, like, far as when you're calculating it, to get to, like, I guess these numbers?
Whenever I do mine, as long as they tell me everything correctly, I'm typically plus or minus $500.
Okay. So that based, in other words, the seller estimate net sheet basically helps speed up far as what the closing cost is going to look for as far as the seller.
Yeah, because I always plug in what I estimate the attorney cost to be. I always plug in the excise tax. I always, plug in what I think the tax prorations are going to be. Let me show you this really quick. Let me move this over here so I can find it, and I'll show you.
And then on my seller estimate net sheet, it also has attorney as far as the closing costs. The column with that, it has attorney fees, the document preparation.
So the document preparation would be always for a seller, but sometimes if you need additional attorney work like drafting documents, you could put that in as separate. So it would just depend on any specialty things that were coming into play. Let me see. I think this is what I want to show you. Yeah, so here you go. And I'm sure yours is probably pretty similar, but if you look at the net sheet, there's a place for all of these different things. So I've got the 3 different lines: estimated sales prices, payoff of their first mortgage, any other things they have to pay off, attorney fees. For deed prep, I can come in here and put it, is it $300, is it $250, is it whatever? How much are the commissions? Any closing costs they've agreed to pay, any home warranties they've agreed to provide. This automatically calculates the excise tax. So if you come in here and you're plugging in all these information, correctly, you can get really close to what you think the net is going to be, as long as you're not missing items. But, of course, the biggest place where most brokers make mistakes is they don't calculate the prorations for, real property taxes or HOA dues because they're not comfortable with it yet. When you get comfortable with it, you can get really, really close to that number, sometimes within $60. Yeah.
Seth, the funds that are paid outside of closing that were on the statement you had up earlier, so those don't figure into the math. They're just listed there for accounting purposes. Is that right?
Because RESPA requires it. The Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act says all costs associated with the purchase of the property need to be itemized on there. So because of that, they are plugged in there. But yeah, they're not going to change the actual numbers at closing because you've already paid it.
Right.
Yep.
Is that what they refer to as TRID?
Yeah, TRID stands for the TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule, and that's because TILA is the Truth in Lending Act. We're going to talk about this next week. TILA is the Truth in Lending Act, which deals with all borrowing of money. RESPA is the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, which deals with real estate closings that you're getting a loan for. So what that basically meant is every single RESPA transaction was also automatically a TILA transaction. And so they did very similar things. And so what they basically said is, well, it's silly for us to require 2 disclosures for this one, 2 disclosures for this one that do the same thing. So they combined it into TRID rules, what they call it. The TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule. So if it's a RESPA transaction, it automatically falls under the TRID rule nowadays. There you go.
That's where banks get hung up. They couldn't disclose that properly.
Yep. Yep. Some of that technical mumbo jumbo, right?
Yeah.
Tell you what I will do, just because of where we're at time-wise, let me give you one of these to kind of take a look at in some groups and just talk each other through it, just to help you understand. Now, the one that I'm about to give you, it's with training wheels. I'll show you what I mean. Give me 2 seconds. So here is the word problem for a closing disclosure to look at. And I'll explain the training wheels piece in just a second. And then here is a blank closing disclosure. So you can see all the different pieces are in there, but it's blank, so you can fill it in yourself. Now, with this blank closing disclosure, it is in a fillable format, but you have to completely download it. You can't just open it in Google Drive. So you have to open it, download it, and then open it again, and you will be able to plug in numbers. So let me show you here. I just did the exact what I said. I opened it, and then I clicked download, and then I opened it again. And so now you'll see it's in this PDF format where you can plug in stuff. So this is a blank one. The one that I just shared with you is got the training wheels that I was talking about. So here's what it looks like right here. If it is in the color purple, it affects both the buyer and the seller. If it's blue, it affects the buyer only. If it's green, it affects the seller only. And if it's orange, it's paid outside of closing. So the math is also all already in here, so you can see how it kind of extrapolates out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw you in some groups for 30, 40 minutes so you can just play around with this, get a little more comfortable, and get a little less panicky about what these closing disclosures look like. Now, I will point out a couple things. If you read this, your life will be so much easier. So here's what I mean. In this section right here where it talks about discount points, origination fee, and of course gives you your interim interest, that is the same interim interest that it's referring to here. We've already done the math. That's why it says see above. So don't put interim interest on the closing disclosure twice. The other thing is these taxes are considered due and payable. So they're going to be a double debit. They're not going to go on page 2. You are going to find a space under other right here, type in tax prorations, put the buyer's portion here, the seller's portion here. Does that make sense? So I'm going to put you in some rooms, let you kind of play around with these.
That was awful and borderline abuse.
Yeah, going from new construction contracts that are X, Y, and Z, definitely a little different ballpark.
Oh, yeah. Borderline abuse, right? Jaleesa's like, I called 911 6 times. Tried to report you for violence and abuse.
My poor team members. I'm like, you guys, I can't.
I just can't. I need an adult. I know.
Math in the mornings.
Yeah, you know, it was just like the timing. I had to like kind of make the call, like, do I keep on this or do I go back to contracts? And so I just decided that I didn't really have the time to dive into all the contract stuff I wanted to, so this is the way we went. So I apologize. Sometimes math is definitely better in the mornings or at least just before lunch so you're fresh but awake and not tired. So this is kind of cruel and unusual, and I apologize. I know. It is not ideal.
That's okay. You just slap me.
Yeah, right. You know, just kick me while I'm down. You know, like just really, just abuse us to the umpteenth degree. I'm sorry.
That spreadsheet has got real tiny font.
It's
on my computer.
Yeah. Well, you know what you need, Phil? You just need a really huge monitor, and then you'll be good to go. You know.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Folks, did anybody get it completely filled out and come up with a number?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Tell them what we got. Did you finish it?
I think so.
Okay, what'd you get? Like, and really, I just need the final. So what is the cash to close for the borrower? What is the net due to the seller?
For the borrower, I got $96,705.39.
Mm-hmm.
And for the seller, I got $97,877.08.
Okay. What did the other group get?
Years, mostly.
Recording in progress.
Sorry. Tiers, is that what you said?
We just filled in the dots. The blanks.
Tears. We printed it out and used the paper to dry our tears.
Hey, can I just make one comment?
Yeah.
The seller is doing 128,250. Is that what you said, Sam?
That's not what I said. I might have done some math wrong.
Well, maybe I did it wrong.
I'm not sure.
I've got the seller getting 128,250.
What about the other group? What did y'all get?
We didn't get to do the finals. We did,
We didn't get to that final calculation.
yeah, we
Didn't get to the final calculation?
That's
Okay.
right.
So it's okay. I'll give you the answer, folks. You know, I want you to see it. So when I looked at, that's why I asked y'all, when I looked at y'all's paper, Caroline and Steve, y'all's group, your numbers were looking good because y'all were sharing your screens. So you looked like you were on the right track. Now, Sam, your numbers are close, but they're not quite there, folks. The final number should have been $95,922.19 from the borrower and $96,942 due to the seller. And so I'm going to share this answer key with you, but if you want to check your work, you should have or discount points, 4,500 buyer debit, loan origination fee, 30, and I'll zoom in a little bit here, 3,600 buyer debit. Paid outside of closing, appraisal and credit report, 435 respectively. Attorney closing fee, 650 buyer debit. Deed prep, 150 seller debit. Title insurance, added together the two policies that there was, 475 for a buyer debit. Pest inspection, also called WDIR, wood destroying insect report, $75 buyer debit. Survey, 350 buyer debit. So if you total those up, you should have total loan cost, $9,650 for the borrower, $150 for the seller. Recording fees, $65 when you combine the deed and deed of trust for the buyer. And you could have, and I would have, put the seller's recording fees right here. And I believe that was, 30 something? Wherever it is. 35. Yeah, so on this answer key, they put it down here. Either way is acceptable. I would have put it under the recordings myself. Excise tax, $900 seller debit. Homeowner's insurance premium, 1 year prepaid, $720. Interim interest, $796.44. Homeowner's insurance initial escrows, $120. Property taxes escrows, $868.75. Real estate commission, $27,000. Home inspection, $450. Property taxes, $752, buyer debit, seller debit of $27.23 to equal the total bill as taxes for closing costs. Okay. The total other costs, $37.72 and $30,658. So you total them up together to get total closing costs from the borrower, $13,422.19. Total closing costs from the seller, $30,808. Bring those down and plug them in for J, right? J for the buyer goes here. J for the seller goes here for their closing costs being plugged in. Other items that go under here would be just the sales price of the property. Total those two together to get the total debits from the borrower, $463,422. Credits from the buyer, for the buyer, $5,000 earnest money deposit there. Loan amount of $360,000 there. $2,000 seller paid closing cost credit there, and due diligence fee is a credit there. Total credits for the borrower, $367,500. If you plug those down below, find the difference between the two. That is how we got the $95,922.19 for the borrower. Seller, whatever. The seller should have just had the one credit for the sales price. What are you doing? There we go. And then for the debits, we've got the closing costs. We got the payoff of the first mortgage. We got the due diligence. Why is a stupid thing doing this?
Verify your identity.
Apparently, I'm a fraud.
Your computer agrees that this is dumb, okay?
Is that what it is? They're like, nope, absolutely not, Seth.
Literally rejecting this session.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly.
This is so bad. We're not going to do it. We won't comply. Even the robots hate it. So, seller credit for the debit, $500 due diligence for the debit, total debits for the seller, $353,058. Bring the two line items down here. Find the difference between the two. Due to seller, $96,942.
Okay.
I see some of what I did wrong. We put, one of the things we did was we put the excise tax on the buyer side.
Yeah.
So excise tax defaults to the seller. So here is, I just accidentally sent it to Sam, but here is the answer key for you fine folks to take a look at. Now, here's where I'll make you feel a little bit better after the cruel and unusual punishment, folks. You do not have an entire closing disclosure on your test. You've got 4 or 5 math questions where you're going to be calculating what it would look like. So I'm going to give you a tax bill. I'm going to tell you the closing date. You're going to tell me who's it a credit to, who's it a debit to. Might do the same thing with rent, might do the same thing with it. That's it. I'm just going to ask you to do the proration math on the test. You are not doing this full thing. But you still, Jaleesa, you still needed to learn the full thing to help your clients out in the real world. Whether the computer likes it, whether you like it, your clients want to know how much money and why and where and all these different things. I'll point out something and then I'll just let you talk to me for the rest of the class. This one little section is the most confusing section, and you didn't even have to do anything with it, but I just want you to know what it is. When we get into a later discussion, more in depth with TRID, the TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule, RESPA has certain things that go along with the disclosures. And those things are not allowing us to do kickbacks from settlement service providers. Those are prohibited. But one of the other things it does is limits the amount of escrows that a bank can legally take from you. And that's what this aggregate adjustment is. Sometimes the banks will want a certain amount in your escrows depending on the time of closing. And they're only allowed to hold certain amounts depending on how close the bill is. So sometimes it will try to be more here, but then this aggregate adjustment is where they back out some of that number where they're not lawfully allowed to hold it. Where they'll basically say, well, we wanted 10 months, but the limits were 8 months, so they will deduct 2 months worth and back it out. That's just in case you ever see that on an actual closing disclosure, that's what an aggregate adjustment is. They are adjusting for limits set by law, based on how much they wanted to hold versus how much they were legally allowed to hold because of RESPA requirements. So that's the one thing that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you just look at it.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not that important, but the pest inspection, I didn't see that anywhere on the document, like saying there was a pest inspection.
On the actual word problem?
Yeah, it was at the WDIR.
That's it. The WDIR, Wood Destroying Insect Report.
Okay.
Yeah, pest inspection for short.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Not that.
And Seth, where did you have the seller concession, the $2,000?
Seller credit, $2,000. Seller credit, $2,000. So what's happening is
Credit for both.
no, it's a debit from the seller, but it is called a seller credit because the seller is crediting that money to the buyer. So don't let it confuse you. These are seller debits, but we called it a seller credit. These are buyer credits, but we called it a seller credit because the seller is giving the buyer $2,000 to pay towards their closing cost. So it's confusing because it's just called a seller credit generically, but it is quite literally a seller debit buyer credit on the closing disclosure.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is not uncommon in any way, shape, and form. That being said, folks, we got about 4 minutes left. I shared the answer key in there. Hopefully you all feel better that you're not going to have to do a full closing disclosure on your test. Just a couple proration problems just to make sure you're good on the math. Nothing too crazy. But you know, I have to teach it to you the full way. So we still might have some more discussions depending on timing, how quickly I can get through the other contracts things next week. So next week we will get back into the scavenger hunt. We will finish answering all those questions. If you made notes, save them. So next Monday we'll finish that. Then of course I'll talk about the other pieces of the contract that we haven't gotten into, and we'll start discussing all the different addenda and amendments and how to use them, things to be aware of, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between.